Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, Mrs. Joubert sat in her car, her fingers trembling, her heart thumping in her chest. She couldn't believe what she'd just seen. She would never have believed it unless she had seen it with her own eyes. There was no doubt in her mind. She wasn't mistaken. What do I do? She asked herself. I can't sit back and do nothing about it. I have to tell Chantal Feeney. I know I'm not good friends with the woman, but everyone deserves to know the truth, don't they? Mrs. Joubert sighed wearily. Over the years she had developed a reputation for being the town busybody. She didn't like being so unfairly labelled. She couldn't help it that she was so quick-witted, astute, and as sharp as a tack. Evidently other people went through life rather like blind mice, never detecting a thing, being unwittingly impercipient and unheedingly inobservant, while Mrs. Joubert was as sharp as a bald eagle, and proud of it too. It was thanks to Mrs. Joubert's savvy perception that the spate of robberies that occurred in the neighbourhood of late had ground to a halt, for it was Mrs. Joubert herself who recognised one of the robbers, a young boy from a neighbouring town, who was involved with a very unfortunate group of boys running away from a robbery at the next-door neighbour's house. She had detected him, and it was thanks to her ingenious eye for detail and photographic memory that the young men had been arrested and prosecuted. It was so typical, she thought. People could be incredibly ungrateful. Mrs. Joubert pressed down the accelerator of her car and did a swift three-point turn in the asphalt road, driving towards the leafy green neighbourhood that she was very proud to call home. It had been a beautiful day, she thought. Too bad it had to be soured and tarnished by the bad news that she was about to convey to Chantal Feeney. The neighbourhood looked so pretty in the late afternoon, with the soft ethereal shadows of sunlight now fading and dimming, while the blue sky receded. It was now painted in an undulating ocean of golds, orange and pinks, to announce the arrival of the soon-to-be evening, that was now eagerly waiting in the wings to glaze the burnished sky in dark black tones of night. A soft breeze was blowing, so that the honey-locust trees on either side of the road were swaying gracefully like dignified, elegant ballet dancers. Mrs. Joubert had lived in this neighbourhood for 20 long years. She was proud to call it home. She knew everyone living here on a first-name basis, and what she didn't know was not worth knowing at all, for she knew the comings and goings of the street like no other. She knew Mr. Rogers at number 46 got up at 4:30 every morning to take his dog Bobo for his morning walk, and that Mrs. van der Berg always went to town for her hairdressing appointment at 2:30 on Wednesday to be precise. She parked her car on the side of the street, pulled up her handbrake, drew in a deep breath, climbed out of her car, slamming the door behind her, and marching over the perfectly mown lawn of the Feeney's front yard, onto the red brick path, up the terracotta steps, to the gleaming navy blue front door of the pretty symmetrical home with its grey slate roof, blue shutters, and wide French windows. Chantal was surprised to hear the knock at the front door. It was late in the afternoon, It was not common for her to have visitors this late in the day. She quickly trotted over to the door and opened it. Mrs. Joubert, the town busybody, was standing there in the doorway. If there was anyone she would least like to see, it was Mrs. Joubert. She smiled politely at the sylph-like figure of Mrs. Joubert, always so elegantly attired. This afternoon was of course no exception. She was wearing a very stylish blue A-line skirt and a pale blue cashmere sweater, with a short string of pearls around her neck, and flat blue ballet pumps graced her feet. Her brown highlighted hair was so neatly brushed away from her face, and Chantelle couldn't help noticing a flicker of sadness in Mrs. Joubert's brown eyes that normally twinkled with humour. "Hello, Ruth," said Chantelle. "Now this is a surprise." "Can I come in, dear?" said Mrs. Joubert. "I need to speak to you about a very delicate matter, if I may. It's of extreme importance." "Of course," said Chantelle, opening the door. "Can I offer you a glass of white wine? I've just opened a bottle." "Sounds lovely, dear." Chantelle led Mrs. Joubert into the living room, and noticed the woman was twitching nervously and taking several gulps of the white wine she had handed her, as if to steady her nerves. She had never seen Mrs. Joubert so shaken before. She found herself feeling empathetic towards the poor woman, who seemed distinctly uncomfortable and restlessly ill at ease, as if she'd rather be anywhere else in the world than in Chantelle's living room right now. "Are you sure you're all right, Ruth? You look very discomposed, almost as if you've had a nasty shock. I do believe you're trembling." "I'll be all right in a moment, Chantelle," Mrs. Joubert assured her. "Now, I'm very aware of what people think about me in the community. I know people think I'm a prying, snooping busybody that puts my nose in everybody's business. But in truth, I'm just very sharp, very observant. I notice things others don't, which has often earned me more than a few enemies, shall we say. Well, I'll say this for you, Ruth. You're the best neighbourhood watch we could ever ask for, and that's a big compliment coming from me. What is it that's so delicate that you want to talk to me about? You've got me rather intrigued. I saw something in town today, something that ruffled my feathers considerably. There's no easy way to say this, Chantelle, dear. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but your husband Richard is having an affair with a woman who looks remarkably like you." Chantelle burst out laughing. "Richard having an affair, Ruth? I think not. I don't think Richard would know how to have an affair. He hasn't got a licentious bone in his body." "This is no laughing matter," said Mrs. Joubert. "I saw your husband in town, Chantelle, holding hands with a woman. It was definitely him. I'm certain I was not mistaken. I waved at him to show him I'd seen him. He gave me this blank look, pretended not to know me." The smile from Chantelle's face faded. "But that's not possible. Richard's away on business in Canada." "I'm sorry, dear. I know it's hard to believe, but it was definitely Richard I saw in town. No question about it. I don't like to tell you this, but if it were me, I'd want to know." "Of course." Chantelle was stumped. Her heart was thumping in her chest. Richard was her very best friend, as well as a husband for over 30 years. Their 2 children had left home. It was a bit late in the day for her husband to be having an affair. And Richard was not the adulterous, cheating type. He'd always been staunchly loyal. There must be some mistake, surely. "I am so sorry, Chantelle," said Mrs. Joubert, whom looked genuinely upset. "I really didn't want to have to tell you this. Thank you so much, Mrs. Joubert, for coming." Once Mrs. Joubert had left the house, Chantelle phoned the hotel in Canada with her cell phone, because if Richard was still in Canada, there was no possible way for Mrs. Joubert to have possibly seen him in town. It would affirm the woman's mistake as clear as day. Her heart sank when she was informed by the hotel that Richard had checked out earlier in the morning. What was going on? Had Richard returned home on an earlier flight? But even if that were the case, Richard would not be foolish enough to be holding hands with a woman in town when he was known by all the locals, as it would get back to her so fast that he was having an affair. Mrs. Joubert had been in no doubt about what she'd seen. What the heck was going on? Chantelle was about to phone her husband's cell When she saw his familiar truck driving up her drive, she could see her husband slamming the door behind him, walking up the steps, wheeling his suitcase. Chantal stared at her husband's silhouette as it moved towards the house. Her mind was a whirl, her emotions spinning around the place like the clothes in a spin dryer, going around and around. She didn't know what to think. Could her husband really be having an affair? The very idea made her nauseously sick to the stomach. She could hear the front door opening and closing, the footsteps of her husband, the sounds of his shoes squeaking on the polished terracotta tiles in the entrance hall. She could hear him throwing down his keys that jiggled in his hands onto the telephone table, and the thump of his suitcase as he left it in the entrance hall. She heard her husband calling her name. "Chantal! I'm back! Chantal!" Chantal did not answer her husband, but remained frozen to the spot like an ice statue. "Chantal! Chantal! Why didn't you answer me, honey?" said her husband, staring at his wife in the living room, who was looking at him as if she was seeing a ghost. In his hands he was carrying a large, exquisite, very expensive bouquet of flowers. Suddenly Chantal felt very irate. She could feel the fury welling up in her chest like a volcano ready to spew its molten lava. It was the bouquet of flowers that had finally put the nails in her husband's coffin and ironed away any wavering doubts she may have had. She had learnt about infidelity on many of the programs she listened to on the radio, about husbands placating and appeasing their shameful guilt by returning home to their wives with large bouquets of flowers. Richard, seeing his standoffish wife's indignant face, was rather perturbed at this uncordial, frosty reception he'd received. Furthermore, the expression she was wearing was like a belligerent, cranky, cantankerous bull terrier that was about to launch a full-scale attack on him. "You think this is funny?" said Chantal, grabbing the bouquet of flowers from her husband and pulling off the heads of the flowers so that the petals were flying around the room like confetti. Richard stared at his wife nonplussed. "You don't like the flowers?" he said, looking rather startled. "I thought they were rather beautiful myself." "It's not the flowers I don't like, Richard," said Chantal. "It's you I don't like. I don't like your treachery," she said, glaring at him with pugnacious, fractious blue eyes that were so wide they almost took up her entire face. Richard's face drained of colour, becoming as white as paper. "What's going on, Chantal? You're so confrontational, so hostile. You're acting very weird." "What's going on?" said Chantal, putting her hands on her hips defiantly. "Richard, please give me a little bit more credit. I'm not stupid. I know you checked out of your hotel in Canada this morning." "That's right, I did," said Richard. "I was coming home this evening, so I checked out of my hotel this morning. What's odd about that? I left my luggage in the hotel storage facility." "Mrs. Joubert told me what you did, Richard. She saw you in town holding a woman's hand." "I know, Richard. I know you're having an affair." Richard's face burst into a smile. He began to laugh. "Chantal, are you crazy? You know I'd never cheat on you. Whatever Mrs. Joubert told you, it's definitely not true. I've only come in from Canada half an hour ago. You can check my flight details if you like. Look, I'll go and get them for you if you don't believe me." Once Richard had shown Chantal the flight details, Chantal felt ashamed for doubting her husband's integrity. "I'm sorry, Richard. Mrs. Joubert said she saw you in town, holding a woman's hand. She was in no doubt about it. She said it was definitely you, but she must have been mistaken." "Mistaken? Of course she was mistaken. For a start, Chantal, you're the love of my life. I'm surprised you would ever think that I could possibly cheat on you. The idea is nonsensical. I wouldn't even know how to have an affair with another woman. The idea of touching a woman that is not my wife gives me the creeps, quite frankly. Chantal, I'm disappointed that you would question my loyalty to you. Number two, do you think that if I was cheating on you, I would brazenly be holding hands with my new lover in town
so that nosy people like Mrs. Joubert would report back to you about my faithless affair. Credit me with a bit of intelligence, will you?"
"I'm sorry, honey," said Chantelle, taking her husband into her arms lovingly, planting a reassuring kiss on his cheeks. "For a moment I really had my misgivings and umbrage about you. I don't know why. When you stood there with the flowers, you looked so smug. I suddenly got these terrifying images of you with another woman. I became completely enraged."
"Tell me about it," said Richard. "You scared me half to death, the way you reacted."
"Mrs. Joubert was so insistent she saw you in town. She said she was in no doubt that it was you. It's so bizarre. She's such a discerning woman."
"Sounds like I've got a double-ganger," said Richard.
The next morning, when Chantelle was bustling around her kitchen, making a delicious chocolate cake for Richard to make up for her unfair accusations, there was a knock at her door. It was her best friend Elsa, standing in the doorway, with red rims around her eyes. She looked dishevelled and very upset. "Elsa, you look dreadful. Please come in. I'll make you a cup of tea." She put her best friend down on a chair, busied herself putting the teapot on the gas hob, spooning the chocolate cake mix into 2 tins, and promptly putting them in the oven. Elsa was blowing her nose, wiping away tears, as well as staring vacantly into space. Chantelle had never seen her behave like this before, and wondered if her best friend had been involved in another Barney with her husband. Elsa had a tempestuous relationship with her husband, and there were times her friend would have blazing rows with him, where they wouldn't talk to each other for an entire week, and they would just sulk. A week later all would be forgiven and forgotten, and then they would make up. By all accounts they loved each other very much, but when they had fights all hell broke loose. But Elsa seemed particularly distressed this morning. Chantelle placed down a cup of tea in front of her friend. "You tell me what this is all about. Is it Robin? What has he done now?" "It's not Robin," said Elsa. "It's you. I saw Richard. He was with another woman in town. I don't know how to say this, Chantelle, but your husband's cheating on you." Chantelle began to laugh. "Dry up your tears, Elsa. You didn't see Richard. You saw his double-ganger. He looks a lot like him. You definitely didn't see him." "But it was Richard," insisted Elsa. "I saw him holding hands with another lady, a woman who looked just like you." "I promise you it wasn't him," Chantelle assured her. But Elsa did not look convinced. It was on a Saturday afternoon, when Chantelle was doing her shopping at the local grocery store, that she saw Richard standing in the store, reading the labels on the back of the bottles of wine. What was Richard doing, she thought, feeling frustrated. They were going to lunch that morning with the Stewarts. They were due there in an hour's time. They had to be quick in their shopping this morning. But Richard was dawdling. Richard was supposed to be picking up their dry cleaning. "Get a move on," she said, tapping Richard's shoulders. "For goodness sake, stop dawdling. Honestly, haven't you got anything better to do than to read the wine labels?" Richard turned around and looked at her, with an appalled look on his face.
"Excuse me, madam, but if I want to read wine labels, I will. It's none of your business, and for your information, I'm definitely not dawdling."
Chantelle could hardly believe it. The man she had mistaken for her husband was definitely not him, as his voice was distinctly different. But the man was identical to her husband, an exact carbon copy. She could hardly believe it. She was about to ask the man who he was, but he had disappeared. She shrugged her shoulders in disappointment. Now she knew why people thought her husband was having an affair. It would seem that a man who looked exactly identical to her husband was walking around town. How was that even possible? Richard was not adopted. He had no brothers or sisters. And yet there was a clone of her husband who looked identical to him. She couldn't comprehend how this was even remotely possible, unless her husband had an identical twin brother. That would be the only plausible explanation, surely. Perhaps Richard was adopted. Both brothers had gone to different homes. But if that were indeed the case, why had Richard's parents never revealed the truth to him? Did he not deserve to know if he was adopted, and if he had a twin brother? She decided privately that at the nearest opportunity she needed to visit Richard's parents to get to the bottom of this conundrum. So she decided not to tell Richard about her encounter with a man that looked identical to him. Even the clothes he was wearing, and his grey hair, looked very similar. It was more than a little bizarre. It was on a Monday morning that Chantelle drove to her mother-in-law's house. She wasn't certain how she was going to broach the subject about Richard with Gladys Feeney, who was a private woman. In fact, both Mr. and Mrs. Feeney were the most self-effacing, reticent, reserved, and evasive people she'd ever met, but they were utterly charming with it. Richard knew nothing about his parents' childhood, or anything about his own grandparents, whom he'd never met, as his parents never ever spoke about the past. He only knew his mother was not on speaking terms with her parents, and his father's mother lived in Australia. When Richard tried to probe his parents about his background, they were never forthcoming. Did the Feeneys have something to hide, she wondered? It seemed more than likely that they did. Gladys Feeney was very surprised to find Chantelle standing at her door. "Come in, dear. This is a lovely surprise. I never expected to see you. Where is Richard?" "He's at work. It's you I've come to see." "Where is Derek?" "Oh, he's not here, Chantelle. He's gone fishing with his friend Hunter." "Is that a problem? Did you need to speak to him as well?" "No, you'll do fine," said Chantelle nervously. "Come in, dear. I'll make you a nice hot cup of tea. I do so happen to have a delicious carrot cake on offer that I made over the weekend." "That sounds lovely," said Chantelle. "I love carrot cake. It's my absolute favourite." Chantelle watched her mother-in-law lay a tray with her fancy Royal Doulton china. The old woman's arthritic hands were trembling as she placed the teapot and cups on the tray, and led Chantelle into the living room. "Would you like sugar in your tea, dear?" "Thanks, Elaine. 2 teaspoons would be great." Elaine Feeney was always immaculately turned out every single day of the week. Today she was wearing a smart tweed skirt with a cream blouse, a small string of pearls, and her grey hair was swept back in a modern, very stylish hairstyle that was very becoming on her. It would seem that Mrs. Feeney looked at least 10 years younger than her 80 years. Her skin was flawless and peachy, with only a few lines around her eyes. She handed Chantelle her cup of tea, her fingers wobbling precariously as she placed it on the side table, and then handed her a delectable slice of carrot cake. "You must excuse me, my dear," she apologized. "These days my fingers always shake. I'm told it's this dreadful arthritis of mine. Let me tell you something, Elaine. Aging is not for the faint-hearted." "You look great for your age, Elaine. If I look like you at 80, I'll be one happy woman, I assure you. And as for this carrot cake, it's absolutely delicious," she said, taking a bite. "So lovely and moist, Elaine. I got the recipe from a coffee shop in Ireland when I was visiting there. The owner graciously gave me the recipe because I was from America. If I'd been Irish, she would have definitely refused to give it to me. So tell me, Chantelle, what's on your mind? Why this off-the-cuff spontaneous visit? Not that I'm complaining, of course. It's a pleasure to see you. And with Derek out fishing, I'm very glad of the company. It can get lonely around here sometimes." "I'm sorry to be so indelicate, Elaine, but I need to know. Is Richard adopted?" Elaine's face grew as white as snow. Her fingers began to shake as she rattled the cup in her hand. She looked like a deer caught in headlights. "What makes you ask that, dear?" "Because I've seen his double in our supermarket. I'm not joking, Elaine, but he was identical to Richard in every single way. I mean, it's not possible for a random stranger to be absolutely identical, is it? Other people spotted him with a woman that looked just like me. They thought Richard was having an affair." "You say this man looked identical?" "Identical," said Chantelle. "You can't believe it. I actually went up to him in the supermarket and accused him of being Richard." Elaine's eyes filled with tears. "I think you must have seen Richard's twin brother," she confessed. "So Richard is adopted, then?" Elaine's face remained as white as a sheet. "I gave birth to a beautiful baby boy once in hospital. I brought him back home, but a day or so later I found that he had died in his cot. I was so devastated. My husband, Derek, knew nothing about it at the time. He was away.
I put my dead baby in a pram. I walked around the park with him. Can you believe I did that? That was when I saw these mothers in the park, talking. One of the women had twin boys in her pram, and the moment her head was turned, I grabbed one of her babies. I figured out that she had 2 babies. I had none, so I could take one of hers, and that's what I did. Besides, it was clear she didn't want her children. "Oh, my God! You didn't!" gasped Chantel. "I did," said Elaine. "I know it was wrong." "What did you do with the baby boy, the one that died?" Chantel asked. "Oh, I took him to the cemetery. I buried him next to my grandmother. No one saw me, and even if they had, they wouldn't have suspected a thing. Babies are very small, you know. It looked like I was planting seedlings, and I planted seedlings as well." "Did Derek know what you'd done?" "No, he didn't, dear. Not in the beginning, that is. You see, Richard looked remarkably like my old baby. The likeness was uncanny. He did say that the baby had grown a little, but then you'd expect that." "Did they not look for the missing twin?" asked Chantel. "I mean, surely there were reports about it in the paper." "Nothing. Absolutely nothing," said Elaine. "I mean, I took out every paper, and there were no reports of a twin being abducted. I was certain I'd be found out, but no one suspected a thing." "That's very strange. More than a little bizarre," said Chantel. "You'd think the authorities would have kicked up a fuss about the missing twin." "Well, I do know the mother was barely a teenager herself. One of the reasons I actually took the baby was because I overheard her groaning to her friends about how she wanted to party all night and wished she didn't have babies. She was going on and on and on about it. One of her friends was saying, 'We'll put the kids up for adoption then.' She said her parents were laying on the pressure for her to do just that. She constantly complained about how she couldn't stand her own babies. I mean, who does that?" "That's absolutely dreadful, being raised by a mother who doesn't even want you. I can almost understand why you took one of the babies away, not that it makes it right." "What are you going to do?" asked Elaine. "Are you going to report me to the police? You can if you want. I've had to live with what I've done all my life. I'm prepared to take responsibility, to face the music. Look, Richard loves you very much. If I did that to his own parents, he wouldn't be particularly happy with me. He's grown up now. You're an 80-year-old woman, far too old to become a jailbird in my book. This abduction took place over 50 long years ago. 1966. That's a long, long time ago. And no reports about the incident in the newspaper. Although it doesn't mean what you did was ethical. And by the sounds of things, Richard's mother didn't even want her twin baby, which might explain why there was no newspaper coverage about it at the time. I'll speak to Richard about it, but I do think he has the right to meet his twin brother. Even his real parents, don't you? What about Derek? Does he know what you did now?" "He does," said Elaine. "I couldn't keep it from him any more. I broke down one day, told him absolutely everything I'd done. By that stage he loved Richard as his own son. So, well, let's just say we decided to keep him. No one suspected a thing, as I keep telling you. Everybody believed he was my real baby, that I'd delivered at the hospital." As Chantel drove away in the car that afternoon, after having spent the day with Elaine, she had no idea how she was going to deal with this rather delicate situation. She needed to tell Richard everything. By all accounts, the news that he'd been abducted by his own mother from a young teenage girl's pram, whom had never really actually wanted him, would hardly be easy on the ear. But he certainly deserved to know the truth. Chantel decided to stop over at the local bakery in town to buy some pecan nut pie. She knew it was Richard's all-time favourite treat. She hoped that the sweet sugar would lessen the cruel blow of hearing such earth-shattering news. Then she saw him in the baker's, ordering a pecan nut pie himself. It was Richard's identical twin. It was not Richard, as the clothes he was wearing were clearly not Richard's. The Richard look-alike thanked the lady behind the baker's counter for his pecan nut pie, turned around to see Chantel looking directly at him. He frowned. "Not you again. Are you going to reprimand me for dawdling?" "No, not at all," said Chantel. "I'm so sorry about the other day. I really am. I got my wires crossed. I mistook you for someone else. I need to speak to you about something incredibly important. Would you mind having a coffee with me quickly?" The man's frown dissipated. "Why not?" he said, glancing at his watch. "I've got a few minutes to spare."
"Thank you. I do appreciate it," said Chantelle. "Would cappuccino suit you?"
"That's lovely," said the man.
When Chantelle was sitting down, she opened her cell phone and handed a picture to the man. "Look at that photograph. Notice anything about it?"
The man frowned. "Who is this?" he said, staring at Chantelle with an expression of bewilderment on his face. "This man looks exactly like me, but it's not me."
"He does, doesn't he?" laughed Chantelle. "Now you know why I told you to stop dawdling. I thought you were my husband. He's the spitting image of you. Sorry, I didn't get your name."
"My name is James Black."
"James, I don't mean to be nosy, but can I ask you a little bit about your childhood? Were you raised by a teenage mother? Were you possibly a twin?"
"Well, I was born a twin," said James. "My twin brother died of SIDS. Well, that's what my mother told me. My mother never wanted me. She treated me like shit. Told me I'd ruined her life. She wished I was dead like my twin brother. That was never easy to hear. She had me very young, you see. She was only 16 when I was born. So after I was 10, I spent my life being dumped from one foster home to another. It was a tough, grueling childhood, one I would sooner forget."
"Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. What if I were to tell you that I believe that my husband might be your twin brother? I think your mother made up the SIDS part. You see, my husband's mother admitted to me yesterday that she had abducted a twin baby, a twin boy, from a pram, especially after hearing the young woman droning on about how she wished she wasn't lumbered with babies so young."
"Well, I wouldn't be surprised. So, I have a twin brother that's alive?"
"I think so. But before I confirm any of this with my husband or tell him about this, I'd like to run a DNA test on the both of you."
"Of course. Sounds like a good idea. It also sounds like your husband got the better deal. I wish I'd escaped the wrath of my mother. Women like her don't deserve to have children."
"Did she go on to have any other children?"
"Good grief, no. She had her tubes tied as soon as she possibly could."
Suffice to say, it had indeed been difficult to tell Richard that his parents weren't his own. Despite the fact that he had been abducted, he had been the lucky one to escape a childhood being raised in a loveless environment by a teenage girl, and spending the rest of his life being dumped from one foster family to another. Chantelle had been surprised by Richard's calm response to her mind-blowing revelations that she thought would distress him.
"I think I've always known deep down in my gut that my parents weren't my own. I don't know how I've known it, but I just have. You sense these things, you know. But how can you be sure that this James Black is in fact my twin brother?"
"I wouldn't have gone to all this trouble if I hadn't had your DNA tested against James's, and there's 100% probability that you're identical twins. In other words, there's no doubt that you are," said Chantelle, bringing out the DNA report from her purse and handing it over for Richard to examine. "James is very excited to meet you. I've told him all about you."
"This is bloody crazy. This says 100%. I have a twin brother," said Richard, breaking out into a jubilant smile. "I've always wanted a brother."
"Well, I've organised everything. Your brother James wants to meet you on the Pacific Trail. He's one of these types that finds it a lot easier to walk and talk. He wants to meet you in the late afternoon, when most of the dog walkers have left the area. He suggests you bring a head torch, but he said if you don't like the dark, then he's happy to meet you first thing in the morning, but he likes to go when there's no one around. Which would you prefer?"
"The evening will be fine."
Richard's account. "Since I was a young boy, I always sensed I was actually adopted. Although I found out I wasn't really adopted, I was abducted. You get a sense about these things, you know. My parents were very evasive about our family history. It didn't bother me to think that I might be adopted. I grew up with amazing parents who loved the bones off me. I couldn't have asked for better parents. Of course, my wife's appalling revelations of my being snatched out of a pram by my mother was shocking, but it turned out that being abducted was the best thing that could have happened to me, as by all accounts my twin brother James did not fare so luckily in his childhood. He grew up in an environment where love was in short supply, so I think a touch of serendipity was almost certainly on my side, although I don't condone abduction in any way. It was hard to fathom I had a brother. I do remember growing up as a young boy. I longed to have a brother. To think that all the time I actually did was rather extraordinary. I had mixed reservations about meeting someone that looked identical to me. I was thankful that James had asked to meet me in the Woodgrove, as the idea of meeting him over coffee would be ever so awkward, but walking with him in nature was infinitely more appealing to me. It already seemed like we had much in common. I particularly loved the Woodgrove, that was accessible to all the locals in our area, which was outside Portland, and the trail was accessed through a farmer's field, not very well known by outsiders, as it had never been marked on the map. It would seem during the day the trail was quite busy with walkers and people taking their dogs for an afternoon stroll. But the moment the day drew to a close and the sun set over the escarpment, you could guarantee the place would become dead. I glanced briefly at my watch. It was 5:30. It seemed I was the only car parked on the side of the road, which suggested my brother James had not arrived yet. In truth, I was rather pleased about this. I took my rucksack out of my trunk and put my headlamp on my head. I opened the hiker's gate and trudged through the field until I reached the coniferous forest, composed primarily of Douglas firs, spruces, hemlocks, and ponderosa pines, although there were, of course, a scattering of oaks throughout the forest. A nice eclectic mix, so to speak. Many that were mature and towered high in the sky, rather like verdant skyscrapers. The sun was setting over the trees in a dazzling kaleidoscope of oranges, tangerines, golds, yellows, and pinks. There was a gentle breeze blowing through the forest, nudging my face with its cool waves of fresh air, almost as if a fan was blowing directly on my face. The trees began to sway gently. Their needled boughs jiggled in the wind, almost as if they too were twitching nervously, reflecting the rising level of angst I was feeling. I could discern an obscure hazy figure in the distance, running through the field to the edge of the forest. At first he looked like a tiny speck on the horizon that loomed closer and closer and closer, and then I saw him as he made his approach. There we stood, standing yards away from each other, staring gormlessly at one another. It was the weirdest, most surreal experience of my entire life, to be seeing someone in the flesh, identical to myself. Not sure I liked staring at myself like this. It made me fully aware of all my flaws that I could see reflected back at me in the figure staring at me, the square jawline, the boyish face, the brown eyes, the feathery brown eyebrows, the long slender legs, the golden skin, the grey hair. James thankfully broke the silence. "This is weird. We're identical. It's a bit creepy, I know, staring at oneself like this. Do you think we're completely identical?" "I hope not," I said. "It would be nice to think we had some discerning differences." "You won't have this," he said, rolling up his sleeves proudly. "I got the scar when I fell off a bike. I was 10 years old at the time." Seeing James's scar sent chills running up my spine, as I rolled up my sleeve to show him my scar. Granted, they weren't exactly the same, but they did look eerily similar. "That's freaky," said James. "You have a scar not unsimilar to mine. What happened there?" "I fell off a tree when I was 10, I told him. "Let's go for a walk," said James. "If you don't mind, I would prefer not to be staring at myself. I've never enjoyed looking at myself in the mirror, so staring at you is rarely rather unnerving." "I feel exactly the same way," I assured him. "Looking at you reminds me of how grey I've become." "Thanks a bunch," laughed James. "I still think we look remarkably young for our age because of our boyish faces. I believe if we dyed our hair brown, people would think we were in our late 30s. It's our boyish faces. It makes us look very much younger than the average person." As we walked in the woodgrove and talked, I realised how much me and James had in common. We were both married with 2 children that had left home. He had grown up in Portland and was raised by the most appalling mother, who was tirelessly complaining about what a nuisance it was to have a kid,
and threatening to have him handed over to the social services if he didn't behave himself. Eventually she did just that. He had never met his father, as his mother was so promiscuous there was no way of knowing who he was, which was a sobering thought, because he could have been anybody. James was married to a woman called Hilda, who looked a lot like my wife. I was to discover that he was an architect like myself, who had recently moved to the area only 4 weeks ago. I mean, what were the chances of that happening? James had come well equipped with his hiking equipment, and after we had walked a long way, we took our seats on the earthen floor, while James opened up his bag, pulled out some chilled white wine, a couple of glasses, sausage rolls, ham and cheese sandwiches, avocado and tuna sandwiches, cheese quiche, chips, chocolate brownies and peanuts. He spread out a picnic blanket on the ground and lit up a portable kerosene lamp. He handed me a paper plate and poured me a glass of wine.
"This looks delicious, James. I must say you've excelled yourself. I've never thought of a picnic at night in the middle of the woodgrove. It really is rather enchanting, is it not?" "Oh, there's nothing like it, bro," said James. "Food always tastes so much better eaten al fresco. I eat it like this at every opportunity." We sat down under a large oak tree, talked, drank wine, and ate, although in truth I hadn't eaten much. I kept getting this airy feeling I was being watched all the time, but I thought I must be imagining things. I glanced down at my sandwiches and was surprised to see most of them were gone. Had James eaten them off my plate, I wondered, choosing to say nothing, and reaching out for a few more sandwiches to replace the ones that James must have accidentally taken off my plate. I do not know how long we sat there under the oak tree, listening to the sounds of the crickets and frogs, and the occasional wails and calls of a coyote. But the night was magical, and James's company engaging and convivial. It must have been about 2 o'clock in the morning. Yes, we were out there that long in the forest, when it suddenly just changed. I heard a strange voice breaking the silence. It had called out in the night, sounding like someone calling a person's name, but the voice appeared muffled and distant. In that moment, everything in the forest changed. It was like the nightly conductor that initiates the singing of the crickets and frogs had silenced his celestial orchestra, while the sounds of the distant coyotes seemed to cooperate with this momentary reprieve, for their calls also dissipated, evaporating like the steamy vapour from a kettle, until they were no more. If the forest had indeed been a film set, then without a shadow of a doubt the actors had been undisputably told to pack up everything and to go home for the evening. You would rightly assume all the electrics had been disconnected. The leaf-blower machine, for example, had been switched off, so that the cool breeze that had pleasantly been blowing all evening stopped whisking up the leaves. The trees stood rigidly still. Not even a lone branch jiggled in the wind, nor did a single leaf stir up on the forest floor, as nothing dared to move, as everything was held hostage to the ominous sound of silence that was so pronounced you could hear a pin drop. The sounds of the forest were now abandoned and estranged.
"Weird," said James. "I wonder why it's so quiet all of a sudden." Then we heard the voice again. It sounded like it was saying, "Atuha! Atuha! Atuha!" Then we heard the thumping sound, as if heavy footfall was stomping through the forest. "Atuha!" came the voice again. "Atuha!" "Someone's coming," said James. It was the weirdest thing, because the voice sounded human, but the footfall was ponderous, as if something hefty and sizable and really Herculean was moving towards us. James and I heard twigs cracking, and then we saw a tree swaying on its own accord, as if something was deliberately shaking it. Then we saw her. I was so astonished and confounded I thought I was going to pass out from the shock. It was a Bigfoot, and a female one at that. She was titanically huge, 8 foot tall, 700 pounds, with small pert breasts, covered in long flowing dark hair that was a jet black colour. She had a distinctive pyramid-shaped head, and a very human face, with a feminine look about it. Then she moved towards us.
I was so terrified I wanted the ground to swallow me whole. Was she going to harm us, I wondered? Then there she was, yards away from us, so close to us, in fact, that I could hear her breathing. She sounded exactly like a horse. "Atua! Atua! Atua!" she called, looking directly up the oak tree we were sitting underneath. And sure enough, sliding down the tree, rather like a fireman's pole, with an effortless, masterful precision, rather like an acrobat, was a skinny little 3-foot Bigfoot, who looked exceedingly sheepish and bashful. The mother Bigfoot pretty much ignored us, but kept chattering away at her son, often referring to him as Atua. She sounded like a belligerent mother. She continued to chatter and chatter at her child, as if giving him a lecture. Then she yanked him by his overlong arm, pulling him in front of her. He looked as if he'd been chastised for his insolent disobedience. He hung his head in shame, his brown mischievous eyes not daring to look at his mother's. She turned around to give us a polite nod. Then she vanished into the forest with her son placed in front of her, as if she was determined not to let him out of her sight. I got the distinct impression he was always getting up to bountiful mischief, and she had had quite enough, like any fatigued, exasperated mother who'd been worn out by their child's nonsensical shenanigans. I was so gobsmacked, I looked at James and said, "Did that really happen?" He nodded. "It did, bro." Then we looked down at our picnic and discovered every last morsel of food had disappeared. We both laughed out loud, knowing that the clever little Bigfoot had ingeniously stolen all our food. Ostensibly the sandwiches that I'd mistakenly thought that James had stolen off my plate had surreptitiously been taken away by a sneaky pair of little hands by a very naughty little Bigfoot, and we hadn't seen a thing. I think the two great illusionist magicians, Penn and Teller, would have done exceedingly well to take pointers from this crafty, wily, artful little Bigfoot, for he pinched almost our entire picnic without us detecting a thing. To cut a long story short, over the years, me and James became very close brothers, my wife and his wife the very best of friends. My mother never got into trouble for abducting me. I mean, why would I treacherously betray the woman who saved me from an atrocious, callous, loveless life, the life my brother James was forced to embrace? It would seem I had a miraculous escape. Over the years, me and my brother, along with our wives, have gone on a plethora of camping holidays together. To date, we never encountered another Bigfoot. I did go and visit the woman who gave birth to me. She was the most appalling woman I have ever met, without exaggeration. She took one look at me and said, "Oh, you're alive then. Thank God I didn't have to bring you up as well. One was quite enough. I told everyone you died of SIDS and that you were buried at the cemetery, and they believed me. No one gave a toss." On a final note, I think it's incredible, given James' infelicious, wretched upbringing, that he turned out to be such a decent man. To date, I've never been more grateful for being abducted. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, Maria sighed sadly as she drove her car down the glamorous street, heavily shaded by tall, voluptuous oak trees, remembering her former days when she'd worked for Mrs. Fortescue for over 15 years in the winter of her life, when Maria had watched the woman, like a fading flower in the meadow, gradually begin to wither until her petals dropped off, one by one. And then, of course, she had died, for the cancer had finally taken the old dear. But as Mrs. Fortescue herself had said, something always takes you in the end. We all have to die of something, don't we? Mrs. Fortescue's family had not been around for the dear old woman, well, not much in the passing years, when she had grown significantly older, which Rose had found wistfully sad and lugubriously cheerless, for it had been lonely for the reclusive old woman, who had become isolated, forlorn and lonesome, with only a scattering of a few loyal friends, and of course the local pastor, who visited her quite regularly. Friends had been few and far between in those days. It had been auspiciously providential that Maria, who had been in Mrs. Fortescue's employment, had been a friend, cleaner and nurse to the woman. The two had grown exceptionally close over the years.
Mrs. Fortescue had described Maria as the favourite daughter she never had, with a great big wink, but Maria knew she meant every word of it. Mrs. Fortescue's 2 children, Rose and Gareth, had barely visited the old dear until they knew that the clock was ticking, and it was only a matter of days before she breathed her last. They had dutifully gathered around her deathbed, like vultures gathering over a carcass. One day, when Mrs. Fortescue's 2 children had left the bedroom for a smoking break in the backyard, Maria was left there alone with her, sitting on one of the upholstered chairs next to the bed with the old woman, reading her a story. Mrs. Fortescue had sat up with a bright, jubilant, sunny smile on her face, looking at Maria with twinkling eyes. "My father's here, sitting over there on the chair next to yours. He says he's taking me home soon." Maria thought Mrs. Fortescue must be delusional, but not once during the course of her cancer had she ever lost leave of her senses, or hallucinated at all. Indeed, throughout her illness she had been of sound mind. Maria reminded Mrs. Fortescue, "Your dad died 40 years ago, don't you remember?" She couldn't understand why Mrs. Fortescue was making such far-fetched, outrageous claims. She took the photograph down from the bedside table, a picture of Mrs. Fortescue's father. "There he is in the picture," she said, pointing to the old man in the framed photograph, smiling in the camera, and bent over his walking frame. Mrs. Fortescue looked at the picture and smiled. "That's him," she agreed. "Dreadful picture, though. He looks wasted and frail there. He looks much better now, young and radiant. He no longer walks with a walking frame. His back is as straight as a pencil." "So you say he's in here with us?" asked Maria, looking perturbed, but rather intrigued at the same time, for she had no reason to doubt Mrs. Fortescue's preposterous, implausible claims, because the woman was very lucid. "Yes, he's here," said Mrs. Fortescue, smiling brightly, "with my little pug Tweedy, who died 20 years ago, my favourite dog. They're both waiting for me." Maria's brow furrowed. "If they're here, what are they waiting for?" she asked. Mrs. Fortescue pointed at the clock. "They're waiting for 5:15. Then I'll go with them to heaven. They say it's so beautiful there." Maria looked around at Mrs. Fortescue's room and could see and sense nothing. If someone was here, surely she would feel their presence, but she felt nothing. The room looked pretty, with the gentle light of the late afternoon throwing its fading shadows of golden light over the bedroom, while the open window was blowing its long white curtains backwards and forwards like a large rambunctious sail on a boat at sea. There was a pretty mix of colourful roses on the oakwood dresser, as Mrs. Fortescue's bed was covered with the finest Egyptian cottons, while the room was fragranced with the sweet smell of lemongrass from the diffuser. The room did not look like a dying person's bedroom. Maria had made absolutely sure of that. She had taken it upon herself to keep the room as cosy, comfortable, cheerful and pleasant as possible, so all her boss's medications were neatly tucked away in a cabinet, but easily accessible. The tranquil room looked warm and inviting, like it always did, and smelt fabulous. "Are you sure your imagination isn't playing tricks on you, Mrs. Fortescue?" she urged. "No, dear," the woman insisted. "My mind is as sharp as a raven's, never been sharper. I'm telling you, Maria, my father is sitting on that chair over there. He says you can't see him, as your other eye is closed." "My other eye closed?" asked Maria. "What's that supposed to mean?" "He said it's an eye that opens when you're close to dying, so that you can see into the other realm." Maria watched Mrs. Fortescue close her eyes very slowly. The clock was registering 5:15, and then Mrs. Fortescue made a strange rattling sound in the back of her throat, and then very suddenly she stopped breathing. Maria was stumped. Mrs. Fortescue had said she was going at 5:15, and now she was dead at 5:15 on the dot. Maria touched the old woman's frail body. It was still warm, but Mrs. Fortescue was definitely gone. Her essence had left the room, and all that was left was a shell, her body. Then a rather strange thing happened. A white balloon just came floating into the bedroom from the open window. Maria held it in her hands, her eyes misting over with tears. "Goodbye, Mrs. Fortescue," she whispered. "Thank you for the balloon." For in her heart She knew it was from the old woman. Rose and her brother marched into the bedroom, having returned from their smoke break in the backyard. They sensed something was wrong. Rose asked, "How's the patient doing?" "I'm sorry. Your mother's just died," she told the two siblings. "I'm sorry for your loss." The expression on Rose's face was belligerent.
"But why didn't you call us, Maria? Surely there were signs she was about to go."
"Sorry," said Maria. "It happened so fast. She was here 1 minute, and then she was gone." She wasn't going to tell them about Mrs. Fortescue's father and the dog Tweedy, who she had claimed she had seen. Maria believed it to be the truth. She had never witnessed such joy on the old woman's face before, and such a bright sparkle in her eyes, that she had witnessed moments before her death. The funeral had been an intimate affair, with a few close family members attending the burial in the cemetery, and Maria had prepared the wake at the Fortescue household with a few friends and lots of snacks. As Maria was walking past Mrs. Fortescue's bedroom, she overheard the two adult Fortescue children having an argument together in the bedroom. She stood outside the door eavesdropping, only because she could hear her name being mentioned, so her ears perked up like a dog. What were they saying about her? She wondered curiously.
"Mum said she wanted to leave the house to Maria. She said Maria was like another daughter to her."
She could hear Gareth's voice saying,
"Are you kidding, Gareth?"
"I'm sorry, sis. I rarely have to put my foot down. I must insist that we follow our mother's wishes. She said she wanted to leave this house to Maria. She said Maria had become like a daughter to her."
She could hear Gareth's voice saying,
"Are you kidding, Gareth? What on earth are you smoking? Leave this beautiful house to a Hispanic cleaner? Mum cannot have been in a sound mind to even suggest such a nonsensical thing. It's an idiotic idea. I mean, who does that?"
"Look, Rose, it was Mum's desire for us to hand over the house to Maria. It would be wrong for us not to honour her wishes. We have nothing to complain about at all. She left us a sizable inheritance, so this house is a drop in the ocean for us. It's no big loss. We could buy several houses of our own with the money she left us. She was a wealthy woman. We should honour her will, should we not?"
"Gareth, I happen to love this house very much. I've always wanted to live here, and I'm going to move in with my family whether you like it or not. Mum never put anything in writing. She left all her assets to us, so I can live here as long as I like. But I will tell you what I will do once our family chooses to move somewhere else. When we decide to downsize, I'll give Rose this house. How about that? It's a fair deal."
"Well, how long do you plan to live here?" her brother had asked. "You know Mum wanted Maria to have this house after she died. You're being very unreasonable, Rose. I told you, sis, it would be very wrong to dishonour Mother's will. If she was here right now, she would be most aggrieved with you. She would be very upset with what you're doing. You know in your heart it is the wrong thing to do."
"Oh, get a grip, Gareth. Get over yourself. I'll do what I want to do. I told you when the time is right, I'll give Maria this house."
"Fair enough, sis. Have it your way. But I'll tell you this, Mum will be turning in her grave. You're being very self-centred and selfish. What would Christopher say if he knew what you were doing?"
"Leave my husband out of this, Gareth. It's none of his business, and if you dare say anything to him, I'll hang your guts for garters."
"Do what you want, sis. I won't say anything to your husband, but I wash my hands of this affair. At the end of the day, you're the one that has to live with your guilty conscience, not me."
10 years later. Maria sighed as she remembered her days with Mrs. Fortescue. 10 whole years had gone by. My, how time had flown by. And Rose Fortescue had not given up on her mother's house. On the contrary, she had refurbished and modernised the place over the years. Maria realised one horrifying thing, and that Rose Fortescue was never going to honour her mother's wishes. As it had only been a verbal agreement, there was not much that she could do about it. although Mrs. Fortescue had told her personally that she was leaving her house to Maria. It had happened one summer day, 5 years before Mrs. Fortescue had actually died. Maria had been telling her about the neighbourhood where she lived, where she had seen some unsavoury characters on the corner of the road selling drugs. There had been 2 shootings up the road from where she'd lived, as she lived in a rather unsavoury part of Portland. "Well, you won't have to worry about all that when I've died, Maria," she'd said. "I've decided to leave this house to you in my will. I'll get a lawyer to attend to my wishes at once." "But Mrs. Fortescue," Maria had exclaimed, "I can't accept such a valuable asset from you." "Of course you can," Mrs. Fortescue had said, "and you most certainly will." Unfortunately, the well-meaning old woman never got around to organising lawyers to attend to her will. She wasn't an organised person, and was a great procrastinator, always putting things on the back burner. So Maria was not in an ideal position to do anything legally. As Maria sat in her rather run-down, dilapidated car that was standing on very weary tyres, looking good enough for the knacker's yard, she studied Mrs. Fortescue's house through longing eyes that hankered to live in a house like this. When Mrs. Fortescue had promised her this house, it had been as if all her Christmases had come at once, but now everything had gone dreadfully wrong. Suddenly she became very affronted, disgruntled and piqued. None of this was fair. She and her husband had 2 children now, the ages of 8 and 10. This by right should be their home. That was as if Rose Fortescue had honoured her mother's wishes. The house was absolutely magnificent. There was no doubt about that. And now with the money that Rose Fortescue had lavished on the place, it looked more appealing than ever. It was a very striking, long, symmetrical home, with large French windows, elegant black shutters, a black slate roof, and ornate, highly polished black front door that was very easy on the eye. The kind of lavish house that would grab your attention with a second look. To the rear of the property, on the lowest elevation, it had floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the backyard, with fabulous views onto a farmer's field, and in the furthest distance was a resplendent woodgrove that stretched back for many miles. Maria knew her children would probably climb under the white wicker fence that separated her house from the farmer's field, and possibly go exploring the woodgrove, if they lived in Mrs. Fortescue's house, as that is what kids did, even when they were told not to trespass on other people's property. Maria regarded the house with a wistful, nostalgic yearning, and said, "You belong to me," under her breath. Then, before she knew what she was doing, she impulsively, spontaneously marched up the long white brick pathway, up the sandstone steps, to the grandiose front door, and knocked on the gleaming gold horseshoe knocker with its lion head emblem. What the heck was she doing, she wondered, and she was about to make a hasty retreat back to her car, when, to her surprise, the front door swung wide open. Rose's husband, who she knew was a brain surgeon at one of Portland's most prominent hospitals, was standing in the doorway with a warm, cheerful smile on his face. It was clearly his day off surgery. "Hello," said Maria awkwardly, her cheeks burning a bright red colour. "Is Rose here? I've come to see her."
"Why don't you come in?" said Rose's husband. "My name is Christopher, although most people call me Chris. Rose has gone shopping briefly, but she'll be back in any moment. Why don't I make you a coffee while you wait?" Maria hesitated, unsure whether it was a good idea to wait for Rose to return. It would probably be wiser to run away as fast as she could. But some inner nudge persuaded her to stay. It wouldn't hurt to have a coffee after all. "Thanks," said Maria. "I do appreciate it. I like it black with no sugar, please." "Coming up," said Christopher, making 2 coffees, one for him and the other for Maria. "Just like you like it," he said, handing her the coffee, which she took from him gratefully, taking a couple of gulps in the hope that the caffeine would steady her frazzled nerves. Maria felt a little bit like a fish out of water in this luxurious home. Who was she kidding, thinking that she could ever live in a place like this? "I worked in this house for Rose's mother, Mrs. Fortescue," she said reflectively. "She was such a lovely old lady. I cleaned her house and attended to all her personal needs. I was in the bedroom when she breathed her last, you know." "Oh, I remember Rose being very upset about her mother dying when she wasn't in the room. I told her that some dying people choose to die when their relatives leave the room. It's nothing personal. It happens a lot.
I imagine you must deal with death and dying a lot, said Maria. I mean, being a brain surgeon.
Not really, said Christopher. You see, I usually operate on patients that I'm trying to save, not the other way round. I'm not really sure I'd be very good at dealing with dying patients all the time. It would be awfully depressing.
It was funny, said Maria, as she drank her coffee. But when Mrs. Fortescue was dying, she told me her father had come to collect her, and that he was sitting in the chair next to her. He said he was going to take her at 5:15, and then at 5:15 on the dot she died, and a white balloon floated into the room. It was so surreal. Maria wondered why these revelations had spilled out of her mouth so easily. Christopher seemed to have opened her up unwittingly. Why on earth was she sharing these secrets with Rose's husband of all people?
That's interesting, although not surprising. You know, working in a hospital, I hear stories like that all the time. It's very common, you know, for people to see loved ones before they die. I had a patient with a benign growth on his brain that needed to be removed or he would die, as it was growing very quickly. It was the kind of procedure that was incredibly risky. If we didn't remove the tumour for the patient, he would die, but he would as likely die from the procedure. Operating on the brain can be very tricky, you know. I told the patient that we would operate on him, but he had a great chance of dying during that operation. For him it was a no-brainer. He told me if he was going to die anyway without the operation, and if there was a slim chance the operation could save him, no matter how slim, it was a risk he was willing to take. You see, he had a young wife and kids to worry about. I think it was my most nerve-wracking operation to date that I've ever done. One wrong move with that scalpel, and it was lights out for him.
That's terrifying. I think my hands would be shaking so unsteadily if that kind of pressure was placed upon me. Did the patient survive the surgery by any chance?
He did indeed. To this day, I don't know how. I marvelled at how smoothly my hands were operating that day. I know it sounds very strange, but I did feel as if I was being divinely helped during the procedure. Then for a moment the patient went into cardio arrest, would you believe it? It wasn't connected to the brain surgery at all, but things can go wrong sometimes, despite your very best efforts. Our patient seemed to have reacted adversely to the anaesthesia. Now, isn't that a joke? The brain surgery was our concern, but that went like a dream. The anaesthesia gave us complications.
So something beyond the brain operation went wrong?
That's right. My patient died for 7 minutes, but we brought him back from the brink of death. I managed to remove the growth very successfully. It was after the operation he told me he found himself floating on the ceiling, watching me operating on him. He said he felt so light, so free, as if he was floating on air. He even described the instruments I was using on him, very correctly, I might add. And he told me about the anaesthetist saying, "Damn, he's had a bad reaction to the anaesthetic." He said he could see his heart being shocked back to life. He said he remembers feeling so detached from his body. He said he felt as free and as liberated as a bird on the ceiling. And then he saw his deceased mother, who told him he could not go back with her. It wasn't his time yet. He never wanted to die, but once he was out of his body, he didn't want to return to it. He said he could feel himself being sucked right back into it, and felt exceedingly annoyed about it.
That is so incredible! Wow! I can't believe it! It does make you think there must be life after death, doesn't it?
Well, I think so too.
What's all this about? Said Rose, coming into the kitchen carrying a large brown shopping bag in her hands, taking various items out of her bag and placing them on the white marbled island. A bottle of cold white wine, red wine, including a baguette, garlic, minced beef, tomato passata, spaghetti and parmesan.
"This is Maria," said her husband. "She worked for your mother for 15 years. I don't know if you remember her at all."
"Of course I remember Maria. Very well, actually, said Rose gingerly, her face whitening. What are you doing here, Maria? She asked, her body physically stiffening, her back straightening, her jaw clenching. Maria felt rather self-conscious as two pairs of eyes pinned on her. I just wondered about this house, actually. It's just Mrs. Fortescue did say, well, she told me she was leaving it to me in her will. But, well, I never heard anything about it. I wondered.
Christopher looked at his wife. Do you know anything about this, Rose? He asked.
Well, it is true. Mum did want to leave the house to Rose, but I decided we'd move into the house and leave it to Rose when we retired. I mean, there's no rush, is there? She said, her face growing red.
You decided? What do you mean, you decided, Rose? Asked Christopher, looking annoyed. Did your mother want to leave this house to Maria or not?
Rose flushed again. Yes, I told you she did. But she never put anything down on paper formally. There was no legal agreement. And why not live here for a start? I mean, I love this house.
But she asked you to leave this house to Maria. She told you verbally. Those were her distinct wishes. Is that right?
Yes, she did, but you don't understand.
But what? Snapped Christopher. You mean we've been living in this house for over 10 years, and it's not even ours? Are you kidding me, Rose? You dishonoured your mother's wishes. That is appalling. How could you possibly do that?
Well, it was our mother's house, and she didn't put anything down formally.
That's right. It was your mother's house. She said she wanted to leave it to Maria. You stole Maria's home, Rose. You broke a promise to your own mother. That is unethical and despicable. But there was no legal documents. That doesn't matter, Rose. Your mother trusted you with a verbal agreement. She wanted you to leave this house to Rose. You dishonoured her promise. That's appalling, you know. I feel ashamed of what you did. I am very sorry, Maria. I must apologise for what my wife has done. We will hand over the house and keys to you as soon as possible. We will get the paperwork and the documents signed over to you once we've bought another house. We'll give you financial compensation for having lived in your home for over 10 years. I think that's reasonable.
Maria could see Rose looking furious, but Christopher, her husband, seemed determined to do the right thing by Rose's mother, Mrs. Fortescue, and Maria herself felt she had won the jackpot. She had so nearly failed to have the guts to go to that front door. Thank goodness for Rose's husband. He was a good man. Maria's account. I could hardly believe it when my Hispanic family with Mexican ancestry moved into Mrs. Fortescue's home. And better still, Christopher, Mrs. Fortescue's son-in-law, had paid me sizable compensation for the 10 years I'd missed out on in living in my home. Considering he and his wife had spent a vast amount of money upgrading and modernising the house, my family were winners in every regard. When you've been poor all your life and been forced to live in a high-crime neighbourhood near Gateway Discovery Park, with unsavoury characters loitering in the dark shadows, it's a monumental relief to move into such an upmarket neighbourhood with congenial people, a very convivial, warm atmosphere where you feel safe for the very first time in your life. I was so used to bolting my doors behind me every night for fear of some untoward, thuggish character breaking into my home. We would regularly see police in our area, as drugs were being sold on every street corner. I remember being eyewitness to these two young black boys who were barely 18 years old, shooting their friend at point-blank range in the head over a drug deal gone horribly wrong. I had seen this through my own window. Regretfully, I was the only person courageous enough to testify to the police about who I'd seen involved in that shooting. I soon learnt why the black community never tell the police a thing. They're terribly afraid of reprisals, recriminations and payback, which might come in the form of a bullet to the head. Me and my husband received numerous death threats after I testified against the shooters. So every day I would return home from my new cleaning job with my head warily looking over one shoulder, wondering whether I would live to fight another day. In truth, you would never look at Gateway Discovery Park and think there was anything unpleasant or objectionably nefarious about the immediate area. In other words, to the untrained observer, you might think it was an agreeable place to live. This deception can steal the obnoxious truth from your eyes all too easily when you see people happily picnic on the viridescent manicured turf, with balloons floating in the air, picnic blankets on the ground, and sumptuous birthday cakes being eaten. It's hard to believe that members of the community, usually youthful young men in their early to late teens, can be so violent, but I'm afraid it is just that. It would seem the youngsters look on human life as cheap and of little value. A small portion of the neighbourhood where we lived was Hispanic, but most of it was predominantly black, and many of the homes were run by fatherless families, which I perceived could be one of the major problems in the community. I believe every young boy needs a father's sagacious guidance, wise instruction, and firm discipline. One of my black friends kept telling me how the pastor in the community is trying to encourage families to stay together, for it is the broken families where things go awry, as the children grow up without parental boundaries, especially young boys, and then they get involved in drugs and street gangs. It is truly pitiful, and such a grievous shame. I don't know what made me speak out to Christopher about the house I'd been promised by Mrs. Fortescue, but I was grateful that I did. If I had not had the courage and boldness to just ask, I would still be living in that less than agreeable neighbourhood. How glad I no longer am. The great thing was there was a little cottage on the property which we could let out to procure an extra income to our lives, so as a result, they certainly changed exponentially. I was so thankful not only to have this amazing home, but that Mrs. Fortescue's wishes had been fulfilled and finally honoured. Once we moved into our home, as I'd expected, my two mischievous sons, Santiago, 10, and Matteo, 8, kept climbing under the fence, running through the farmer's field, and playing in the woodgrove. I knew they were trespassing on private property, and had in mind to contact the farmer myself, and asked him if he minded my children playing on his property. I was informed by the locals that he was a very amenable man. Unfortunately, I was constantly distracted by the demands of everyday life, which have a habit of consuming your attention. I was in the throes of choosing fabulous furnishings for our home, and got swept away by the excitement and enthusiasm, as I'd never had the financial freedom to decorate my own property before. Without fail, every day after my kids returned home from school, all they ever wanted to do was to go and play in the woodgrove. They claimed they had made a very good friend there with dark hair, whom was called Wahili. I remember thinking it was rather a strange, peculiar name. I kept saying to them, "I think you mean Wally." They'd say, "No, Wahili." Santiago, my son's story. I was so excited to move to our brand new home. I didn't like the area where we used to live, as although on the surface it might look all right in passing, often when the shadows of nightfall descended over our neighbourhood, bad things would invariably happen. It was not uncommon to hear the inauspicious, baleful sounds of shooting going on in our neighbourhood. My parents always locked the front door of our home every night. I could see my mother often looking rather scared, as there were some treacherously vindictive people living in our neighbourhood, who seemed to be so duplicitous and guileful in their intentions. You could see drug dealing going on in our neighbourhood, on all the street corners, but the moment the police patrolled the place, the neighbourhood would become very quiet. I was always glad when the police were cruising our streets. It was the only time I felt safe. When my mother told us we were going to move to a fancy, prestigious, upmarket neighbourhood, it seemed like a dream come true. I knew I would only believe it the first night I actually lay in bed, in a really grandiose bedroom. When we finally moved into our brand new home, it was the first time I actually felt secure, as none of those furtive gangster types were hanging on street corners with their overbig hip artist sagging Kering jeans, worn below the waist, almost falling off their backsides, along with their swanky Gucci or Nike trainers and their Stone Island or Woody and Lou hoodies. The gangsters always liked to wear hoodies, as it hides their faces from the police. Of course, soon after me and my brother moved into our incredible house, our attention was focused on the woodgrove. For some reason we were drawn to that place magnetically, as if the distant tall vertical trees were actually calling our names. It wasn't only that, but it was marvellous to live in the countryside outside of Portland. Of course my mother warned us we couldn't go playing in the woodgrove, as she'd have to speak to the farmer first to get his permission. Being mischievous kids by nature, with a fervent inquisitive curiosity, we decided we would visit the woodgrove at night, when my parents were obliviously fast asleep. They wouldn't suspect a thing, would they? We didn't feel scared leaving our house at night, not like we'd done in our former home. Even my parents had become more relaxed and mellow since the move, and were not as pedantic about locking the doors. It was on a Friday night in late summer, with autumn on the threshold of making her appearance known. It would seem that the old oak tree in our backyard was already shedding her leaves rather early, so some of the signs of autumn were flickering over the landscape as nature was preparing for the cooler months ahead. I do recall my bedside alarm clock going off at 12:30 at night. It made a hideously annoying whirling sound. I surreptitiously crept into Matteo's room to wake him up. Although Matteo was 8, he was a lot lazier and slothful than I was, hence his nickname Sloth. He groaned warily, claiming he didn't want to go to the woodgrove after all. He wanted to sleep. Of course, I was exceedingly annoyed with him, as I didn't want to frequent the grove on my own. So I guilefully manipulated the situation, instinctively pouring a glass of ice-cold water over my brother's face. Thankfully, it masterfully did the trick. I will admit he moaned a lot, but once we had dressed in our jeans and sweatshirts, along with our trainers, his former tiredness deserted him. Much like myself, he was now capriciously fired up with an unbridled, audacious enthusiasm, and was very much wide awake. The wonders of ice-cold water are miraculous to wake the most sluggish, lackadaisical of people, just so you know. We were like two frenzied bees, excited about the night that lay ahead of us, almost as if we could smell the sweet, fragrant bouquet of honey on the wind. Looking back on this impetuous event, I don't know why we were so enamoured by the idea of going into the woodgrove. What were we anticipating to see in the dead of night? We didn't think of mountain lions, bears or coyotes, all the dangers of a rural town from a wildlife perspective. We gave those thoughts no engagement or ponderous reflection, for such ideas were not discharged into our whimsical, naive minds. We both gathered our torches, tiny little things the size of a small hand, with a powerful illumination we had received in our Christmas stockings the previous year. They were chargeable, which was great. We both climbed out of the window into the living room, as it was on the ground floor, and we could easily wiggle through it. When we were out in the backyard, my heart was fluttering. I couldn't believe how tenebrous it was. The dark was all-consuming, as a heavy mist appeared to have blocked out the moonlight, while the twinkling stars were almost obliterated by the darkness. Worse still, a cold wind appeared to be blowing. I began to shiver, suddenly realizing that things were a lot colder outside than I could have envisaged. But I'd be damned having to go back to the house to get my anorak. So me and my brother ran through the farmer's field as fast as we could to warm up. It really was quite spooky. The light of our torches offered us a measure of comfort, but not much. Then we reached the trees. Their tall, imposing silhouettes that seemed so congenial and welcoming in their verdant ensemble during the day, under a cobalt blue sky, at night appeared threatening and menacing, as if they were attired in velvety black leaves, or clothes if you like humanoid giants. The wind whistled through the ponderosa pines, Douglas firs and oak trees, so they rustled and swished against the blustering, boisterous assault. The high-pitched screeching noise the wind made sent shivers pulsating down my spine, as the sound was like disembodied ghosts wailing into the night. As we entered the forest, it was pitch black, caliginous, sombre, foreboding, so oppressively leaden and gloomy that all my enthusiasm died and waned like the light on a candle wick. My excited heart, that had formerly been flapping away with enthusiasm, began to thump in my throat with a salient anxiety. It was then that something pounced on me unexpectedly. I found myself falling backwards onto the soft earthen floor, where I landed on the ground with a bump, while a strange, ambiguous creature was staring down upon me. I was so confounded that I stared up at the creature in astonishment. What the heck was this thing, I wondered? A boy, covered in hair? How was that even possible? My brother just froze to the spot, like a terrified mouse. He began to wobble and shake like a jelly.
The critter was about 4 foot tall, spindly and skinny, with overlong arms, a muscular torso, a pyramid-shaped head with a human face. He was covered in fine long black hair, with auburn highlights. He stepped away from me after I screamed, clearly upset that he had scared me. I remember hearing the words in my head, "I didn't mean to scare you." It was weird because no one has spoken to me that way before, in my head I mean. I realised then he wanted to play with us. Soon me and my brother forgot that he was scary at all, as we adjusted to our strange new friend, in the same way we had adjusted to the cooling temperature. We told him what our names were. He told us his name was Wuhali, and then when the winter came he would be moving away, so he wouldn't be here for very long, but in the meantime he'd like to be our friend. He told us he was an only child, and that his mother had had dozens and dozens of miscarriages, so when he was born she was very happy, and he said he got lonely without any youngsters to play with, but his mother had been trying to have a sister or brother for him, but to no avail. So after he was born, she never fell pregnant again. I don't know why we communicated with him so easily, as he left impressions in our mind which we discerned were not our own thoughts, and me and my brother compared notes, and our impressions were exactly the same. We only learnt when we were older it was telepathic communication, but it's a hell of a lot easier than opening your mouth all the time. We regularly played hide and seek with Wuhali. We often saw his mother watching us from behind a tree. At first she intimidated us because she was so massive. She was easily 7 foot tall and 500 pounds. But her deep-set dark eyes, the colour of treacle, were so kind, and she seemed so happy that we were interacting with her son. She enjoyed watching us play, and was so nice to us because Wuhali was so good at playing hide and seek, and so when we were struggling to find his location, she would secretly point to where he was hiding so that we could easily find him. The enigmatic thing about Wuhali is he could stand still against a tree and almost become invisible, or one with it, rather like a chameleon. You could easily not notice him at all, so his mother's intervention was a massive help. One time she pointed at a tree, and I went up to it and couldn't see Wuhali there at all. But when I felt the tree trunk, I felt Wuhali's hair, and I knew at once it was him. I'll say this, his hair felt exactly like human hair. It was definitely not fur. During the daylight hours, when we came back from school after we'd done our homework, we would play with Wuhali in the woodgrove. All we needed to do was call his name, and he would be there. As the trees finally shed their leaves, the days grew ominously colder and darker, and as winter fortuitously made her approach, the weather became colder. Me and my brother decided we wanted to invite Wuhali around to our house for a celebratory farewell party, as he would be leaving soon. Me and my brother were so sad. We loved Wuhali. We'd never met anyone like him before. Back to Maria. I knew my kids had been sneaking in the woodgrove during the day. I wasn't very pleased with them. No sooner had they got home from school, they would just go into the woodgrove. They would ask me to make extra sandwiches at lunch for their friend, which I thought was rather strange, but being a boy, maybe he was just too lazy to make his own, I thought. I was frustrated about their visits to the woodgrove. I hadn't got around to contacting the farmer to ask for his permission for my kids to play on his premises, but when my kids claimed they were playing with a friend in the woodgrove, I automatically assumed it must be the farmer's child. I was terribly pleased my kids had made friends with one of the local children, but heartily disappointed that they seemed less interested in making friends with the other local neighbourhood kids. It seemed that they were very attached to a boy they called Wuhali, as they could never stop talking about him. They would say things like, "Wuhali thinks it's going to be a very cold winter this year. Wuhali says there's exactly 350 shades of gold in the sunset. Wuhali says that the wild ginger growing in the woodgrove is excellent for a sore stomach and great to stimulate a flagging mind. Wuhali says the neighbour's dog is sad as his friend died and he's very lonely." I remember thinking, Wuhali sounds like a very peculiar little boy talking about the shades of sunset and the neighbour's dog's emotional distress, but my kids seemed to like him a lot, and in the end, wasn't that all that mattered? At least my kids had a friend they really liked, so I was secretly rather thrilled for them. I thought his name was possibly Wally, and was being mispronounced by my children.
One day my 2 children told me that their friend was going away for a while. They wanted to have a leaving party for him. I suggested we invited all the neighbourhood kids to come along as well. They insisted it must only be the 2 of them and Wuhali. Furthermore, both my boys insisted on coming shopping with me to buy treats for the party. They were normally disinterested in food shopping, so the fact they were coming along with me to shop for this party was in itself incredulous. They wanted to make sure that I bought the right stuff, as Wuhali had very particular tastes. They desired balloons in aquamarine, blue and pink, peanut butter jelly sandwiches on brown bread. They wanted barbecue-flavoured chips, Kit Kats, apple crumb pie, chocolate nuts, caramel nuts, sausage rolls, sticky barbecue ribs, and tons of grapes. The party was prepared for Wuhali. I had balloons all over the kitchen, and the food spread out across the table. When I first met the boy, he seemed incredibly shy and very wary of me, as he was not entirely sure I could be trusted. At the time, I didn't realize he was a Bigfoot. In fact, at first I thought he was a kid wearing a monkey costume, as his face was just like a human child's. I soon realized that the hair attached to Wuhali's body was in fact real, and not a costume at all. I remember thinking, what the hell? My children behaved as if he was just another kid. I watched in awe as they interacted together. It was like they were talking to each other telepathically. Wuhali was delighted with his party. He loved the pink, blue and aquamarine balloons, which were his favourite colours. Following the request of my children, I was playing soft drumming music in the background which Wuhali appeared to enjoy. I watched him in awe as he tucked into the apple crumb pie first. Then he ate the barbecue ribs, the grapes, the nuts, and finally the peanut butter sandwiches and chips. To date, I have never, and I mean never ever, seen anyone eat food with such an enthusiastic appreciation. When someone is made this happy by your gesture of kindness, it fills you with an incredible joy. With every mouthful, his face lit up like the fireworks on the 4th of July, and in the back of his throat he kept making sounds. My kids kept saying, "Mum, Wuhali loves the apple crumb pie. Mum, Wuhali loves the nuts." I could see the kids were thoroughly enjoying themselves, laughing and joking, while Wuhali was chattering away happily in a language that was very distinctive, but he spoke and talked telepathically at the same time. I remember Wuhali had an incredibly handsome face with distinctive Native American influences. I say that as his cheekbones were very high, his jawline square, his eyes somewhat deep-set and hooded, his forehead slightly sloped. When the party was over, my kids hugged their friend, their eyes filling with tears as he was moving away. I was surprised as Wuhali turned around and actually hugged me. I was so touched to the quick that tears also began to form in my eyes. He was such a lovable character. Needless to say, after Wuhali went away, my kids were plunged into a deep sadness, and although they are now fully grown up, they describe Wuhali as one of the best friends they ever had. As my son says today, he truly was the salt of the earth. I'm sure he is out there somewhere, but we've never seen him again. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, it had been a muggy, clammy, soupy hot summer's day, with sweltering ambient temperatures, well in excess of 40 degrees. And with the air conditioning facility having broken down in the offices, everyone was fatigued, hot, grumpy, and sweating profusely. It didn't help that they were working late in the evening, discussing which hot sauce labels should go to market, and debating the labels for a selection of new cookies soon to hit the shelves in American supermarkets nationwide. Barbara Patterson, known by her workmates as Barbie, absolutely loathed hot weather with a passion. She was the kind of person that loved the cold days of winter, especially when there was snowfall, as she thought nothing was more magnificent, seeing the world clothed in carpets of glistening white snow. Granted, she did complain if the weather got too cold, but even so she had always found the cold weather rather invigorating and revitalizing. She was finding the cloying, stifling, suffocating heat in the offices rather insufferable.
Everyone was heartily relieved when Bobby, one of the work colleagues, returned from the local store with some ice-cold drinks along with a huge bag of ice. Everyone drank ravenously. Their thirst was insatiable, as dehydration was a huge risk in the rigorous tropical heat. Soon the pizzas arrived on the scene. Everyone seemed to be craving salt in this hot weather, so the cheese on the pizzas did the trick, satiating those quintessential salt cravings. Once they'd eaten their pizzas, Barbara announced that now was decision time. "Now that we've cooled down substantially," said Barbara, "can we get back to work?" Everyone gathered around the board table with heavy groans, as the Turkish bath-like heat had languishingly worn them to a frazzle. Everyone looked like drooping flowers in a meadow, flagging, tired, disinterested, reflecting their impassive lassitude and heedless insouciance. "Look, everyone," said Barbara, taking authority. "I know we're worn out and apathetic, given this god-awful heat wave, and a broken air conditioner certainly doesn't help things, but we really need to discuss the hot sauce label. Once we've made our decision, we can all go home. So I just need you to focus for the next half hour. This one has my vote," she said. "I really love the chilly picture here, of the cartoon character, of a man wearing a sombrero, standing under a Mexican fortune tree, or money tree. It looks very auspicious, does it not? And the casual curls of the free-flowing writing are very relaxed. This whole cartoon makes me think of holidays in Mexico, eating tacos while getting rich," she joked. It wasn't long before everyone was arguing about which hot sauce logo was the best, and finally everyone settled for Barbara's astute choice. That was the most appropriate choice of all, appealing to the customers. "You see," said Barbara, "when a shopper is at the supermarket, the only way we can sell to them is subliminally. It's very important that our hot sauce stands out on the shelf so that people are drawn to it unconsciously and pick it up and throw it into the trolley." She turned to her white screen to point to the video footage she was now playing. "This was me doing some market research recently. Now here I am in Walmart, asking customers why they're choosing the hot sauce they're buying. 'Hello, madam,' she was saying in the camera. 'May I ask you why you've picked out this hot sauce?' The woman scowled in the camera. She looked rather rough around the edges, as if she possibly hadn't bathed for a decade. And she stank of booze. Well, it certainly looked like she did. "I go for price every time. This hot sauce is the cheapest. That's why I naturally buy it," she said. "I mean, why pay a penny more than you have to?" A man was reaching up on the shelf, taking down a bottle of hot sauce, throwing it into his trolley, without even thinking twice about it. Barbara, on seeing him, approached him like a vulture, eagerly descending upon a carcass. The man's face visibly brightened as Barbara, with her long dark hair and bright blue eyes, descended upon him. She was easy on the eye, a very attractive woman. "May I trouble you for a moment?" she asked the man. "You can trouble me any time you like," he teased her. "Look, I was just wondering, sir, why you were buying this particular brand of hot sauce." "Oh, this," said the man, examining his hot sauce. "Well, it's the brand, is it not? I know it's good. I buy it every time without fail. It's reliable, never lets me down. Rather like my Land Rover Discovery parked in the car lot out there," he joked. "No, seriously, I've eaten this hot sauce for many years. My mother used to buy it when I was a child." "So you're very into your branding, then?" "Of course," he laughed. "I always buy Hellmann's with my mayonnaise, Heinz for my tomato ketchup, Hidden Valley for my ranch dressing, French's for my mustard, Jif for my peanut butter. I mean, you cannot go wrong with the well-known brands. They're reliable. They never let you down." "Thank you, sir. You've been most informative. I truly appreciate your help." "My pleasure. Any time." Once again, Barbara is seen in the footage approaching an elegant woman, who was looking through the hot sauces with a careful attention. "Hello, madam. May I trouble you for a brief moment?" She was a slender, waif-like creature, wearing a dark suit that nodded shyly in the camera. "What is this all about?" she asked awkwardly. "I'm just doing some market research. I wanted to know why you popped this particular hot sauce into your trolley." Oh, well, I naturally read the back for the ingredients to check that there's no MSG. And then I thought I'd try something rather different. You see, I'm rather adventurous. The label on the back appeals to me. It makes me think of holidays and sunny locations.
So there you are, said Barbara, facing her wary audience. We have 3 types of customers here. One that is dictated by price, the next customer by brand and quality, and number 3 is whom we're reaching out to, the people willing to experiment with something a little different. So our label needs to attract them in the first place. You heard it from the horse's mouth herself. She said it. I like this label. It makes me think of sunny locations. Makes sense, said Bobby, and everyone agreed. When you think of hot red chilies, you think of sunny, warm locations and fabulous, marvellous holidays. I think you've got our vote, Barbara dear, on the hot sauce with the sombrero, chilies and the man standing under the Mexican money tree. That seems rather auspicious to me. Almost as if on an unconscious level people are secretly attracted to the good luck it reflects.
Good, she said. That's settled then. I'll send the label off to the company for their final approval, which will be affirmed and verified shortly. Barbara was very influential and persuasive. She hummed happily to herself that everyone had been effortlessly persuaded to go with her favourite choice. No wonder her boss, Richard Beaubois, had put her in charge of marketing. She was the kind of person that could literally sell ice to an Eskimo. Once all the labels had been agreed upon, it would almost certainly be time to go home. Some of the staff were still talking in the offices as they finished the leftover pizza, that although cold was still delicious, along with a cold bottle of white wine that had mysteriously appeared out of the refrigerator and was being passed around in wine glasses. Barbara was determined to get out of the offices as quickly as she could. She could feel the sticky sweat rolling down her back, the back of her legs, and accumulating at the back of her neck as well. Even her hair was damp. Worse still, her once radiant makeup had run all over her face. She quickly dashed to the ladies' room and stared in horror at her reflection in the mirror. At the woman that was staring back at her, looked like a washed-out old hag. It didn't help that the smudged mascara under her eyes gave an appearance of having deep hollow sockets. At the very least she looked like a panda. She quickly splashed cold water on her face, feeling instantly relieved and revived. This weather was crazy. She had seen on her cell phone that some elderly New Yorkers had died because of the searing heat wave, and she wasn't at all surprised by this horrifying revelation. This killer heat wave was no laughing matter. Everyone was blaming it on climate change, but Barbara was not so sure about this. She was a staunch believer that climate change was all a myth. In her lengthy research, one scientist had claimed that over the centuries the global weather went through cycles of hot and cold, and the global temperatures were rising due to these natural fluctuations. It was hardly a wonder that people living in colder countries were so much more industriously, efficaciously productive, she thought to herself. Hot weather just drained you, wore you out, so that you had no energy, and hence became impudently fruitless. She was amazed that she had successfully got through the long-winded, dispirited presentation, as she had felt she'd pass out from the heat, or that some of her work colleagues might fall asleep. But she had masterfully held their undivided attention, which was an accomplishment in the circumstances. It indeed was a nightmare not to have the air conditioning working, and it could be a few days before it finally got fixed. She had learnt that all over New York people's air conditioning systems had gone awry, and just when you needed them most, it was so typical. She was hoping the maintenance company would be there to fix the problem as soon as possible. Thank God the air conditioning was working in her New York apartment. She could hardly wait to get back home. She was already fantasizing about having a long, warm soak in the bath to soothe away the troubles of such a hot day. It was dark outside in the car park on the 4th floor, where all the staff parked their cars daily at their allocated spots. There was only a scattering of outside lights on in the main building, so it was airily quiet. Barbara opened her purse, pulling out her car keys. They jiggled in her hands. Even outside in the car park, the cloying heat was unkind, very hostile, greeting her face with waves of hot air like a hairdryer.
Oh, I hate this weather, she sighed. Winter, please get here soon, I beg you. I promise you I will never ever complain about the cold again. As Barbara placed her keys into the lock, she discovered her lock was jammed. What the hell, she thought. She tried her key in the lock once again, twisting, turning and pushing it as hard as she possibly could. She said out loud, "This is all I bloody need, after this exhausting day." She was about to return to her offices to ask one of her work colleagues for help. But the next thing she knew, a man had grabbed her, placed some duct tape around her face, thrown her in his arms, and was running with her towards his white van. Barbara was so nonplussed as the man began tying her legs and arms. He was hauling her in the back of his van. She did try to fight off this man with jerking movements, oscillating her arms and legs, but to no avail. 3 of her work colleagues were on their way back to their cars when they saw a strange man stuffing a female figure into the back of his utility van. She appeared to be resisting him. So they approached him to challenge him, wondering if the mysterious woman might in fact be their boss, Barbara, who was supposed to have already left, but her car was still in the car lot, without any sign of Barbara. She had only left minutes before, supposedly. What the heck was going on? They sensed this enigmatic man was clearly up to no good. "What are you doing?" they demanded. "There's a woman in the back of your truck. She appeared to be resisting you. What's going on?" The man looked at them vacantly and said, "I don't know what you're talking about." And then he pulled out his rifle from his holty and shot 3 men at point-blank range. The last one was Bobby, who was begging for his life. "Please don't! Please no!" But the final shot thundered into the air. One more work colleague, who had been trailing behind the others, saw his 3 friends talking to a man standing outside a white utility van, and then one by one he saw his friends being shot at point-blank range. He was so startled, his heart began to thump so violently through his chest. His adrenaline coursed through his veins. He had a desperate desire to get away from this place as fast as he possibly could. His mind was like a roller coaster of emotions. But once the van with the shooter had absconded from the scene, he finally came back to his senses, darting hurriedly towards the man that was managing the car lot on the ground floor. At first the words did not come out of his mouth. It was almost as if his voice had been confiscated by fear, and as if his words were stuck in the back of his throat. The parking attendant knew at once something was terribly wrong, for he had witnessed a dreadful glint in the man's eyes that suggested he was embroiled in a cocoon of shock. He reached swiftly in his pocket, pulling out a droplet bottle of rescue remedy. "Take a few drops of this stuff," he exclaimed. "I suffer from anxiety myself. The stuff works every time." The man reached out for it, pulling almost the whole bottle of rescue remedy into his mouth, and said, "Oh, my word! Oh, my word! 3 men! 3 men! They've been shot! In the back of the heads! Call the police! Call the police at once!" The men had been shot, and the police were called to face a dreadful scene of carnage, as 3 dead bodies, all shot at the back of the head, were now dead. But Barbara had been abducted by this strange man, while her car remained in the parking lot, along with her keys and her purse, that were lying on the concrete floor, with her money, lipstick, and other odds and ends strewn all over the concrete. "What the hell happened here?" said the police officer, eyeing the scene of carnage with a horror, as there were 3 dead bodies lying on the concrete floor of the car park. Barbara's story. I lay in a stranger's van, in the back, with duct tape taped around my mouth, preventing me from screaming out or crying. My hands and feet were tied up tightly with rope. This stranger had masterfully managed to tie me up with only one hand. I mean, how did he do that? While I'd been fighting desperately to get away. Something told me he'd done this before. The feeling wasn't good. I was in a dreadful state. This had been the most abysmal day of my entire life, with such searing temperatures, and now this had to happen. Just my bad luck. Ostensibly, the van that I'd been thrown into was rather like a sauna on the inside. It was unbearably suffocating. There was absolutely no air conditioning in the back.
But then that's what you would expect from a utility vehicle, which should not be hauling around human cargo. The stranger that had tied me up so callously thrust me into the back of the van. 3 of my work colleagues spotted me and interrogated him, asking him why he'd thrown a woman in his trunk. For a moment I had a fleeting hope that I might just be rescued. Then the most terrible thing happened. I heard one gunshot, another, and then my work colleague Bobby begged for his life. Then I heard the 3rd and final gunshot going off. Everything became ominously silent. I could hear my abductor getting into the front seat of the van, slamming the door behind him, and driving seamlessly through the parking bay with an effortless ease. I was shocked and appalled by what had transpired. For a moment it felt so illusionary surreal. All I can say to you is when something happens like this to you, it's almost like you feel you're playing a fictional role in a movie. The director is going to say,
"Cut! That was marvellous. Well done. Excellent performance, Barbara."
It felt like the whole thing happening to me was not real. It was almost as if I was outside myself, watching this phantasmic movie. I knew in my gut that my work colleagues were dead. This startling revelation almost seemed hallucinatory, as if I had imagined the whole thing, made it all up. Surely in any given moment someone was going to tell me that this was a double entendre, joke or a shaggy dog story. Please, my mind begged, please may that be the case. But as the van steamrolled and snaked down the long windy uniformed roads that had first appeared seamlessly smooth and frictionless, but then the roads changed significantly, becoming ever more precarious, unstable, rocky and bumpy, so the whole van jolted up and down quite rigorously. I realised then this was no joke. I was not playing a role in a fictional movie. This was real. I had been abducted by an awful man. 3 of my colleagues had been shot by this vicious reprobate and were likely to be dead. What were his nefarious, iniquitous intentions with me? They couldn't be good, and would likely end up tragically. The picture was not rosy. The future was bleak, if there was any future at all. I loved my work colleagues like brothers and friends, so knowing that they were very likely dead made me feel sick to my stomach. I could feel my guts churning inside of me, as if I'd eaten something that had given me food poisoning. It would seem your guts are closely connected to our emotions, as mine were grumbling, twisting, turning and churning. I could detect the bitter taste of bile in the back of my throat. Shock can do a strange thing to you. It can have the effect of rendering your mind in a pendulous place of disbelief, a failure to accept what is currently happening to you. It helps to momentarily shield and cushion you from shock. So slowly and surely you come to terms with the horrifying bitter truth of the reality that has transiently ensnared your life like a fly entangled in a silken spider's web. I did not cry. No tears spilled down my cheeks. For a moment my mind emptied itself of any thoughts. I lay there in the back of this trunk, on a long pumped-up pop-up mattress. I could see the inside of the van clearly, the white aluminium walls, the inside windows that had been taped up from the inside with duct tape, so no one could look inside the van. It smelt damp and really stale, horrible in the van, musty and mouldy. One thing that sent a dreadful shiver down my spine was a bloodstain on the inside of the van, leaving me in no doubt that I was not the first woman he had abducted, and was unlikely to be the last. What was wrong with him? He must be sick in the head. And to shoot 3 of my friends at point-blank range, he clearly was an unhinged character. I could see a bright red plastic toolbox open, filled with handcuffs, chains, screwdrivers, and God knows what else. Was the man some kind of sadomasochist, I wondered? What the hell was he going to do to me? If only I could get my hands on one of those tools to use as a defensive weapon. I had visions of Jack the Ripper, and I could imagine him dissecting my body, just for the fun of it, like a warped degenerate. Until this point in my life, I had never encountered evil. Not really. Not like this. Of course I'd heard about it on television before, seen it in fictitious movies and books.
heard about it occasionally on the news. Bad things that happen to good people. Dead bodies that resurface in peculiar places. Under bridges, in fields, woods, deserts and beaches. Would I become another dead body among the many, found lying deceased in a shallow grave? I tried to wiggle and move my body, pushing my legs against anything to try and loosen the tight hold of the rope around my legs, but to no avail. I remember telling myself, "You have to calm your mind, Barbara. You have to think. You need to decide what you're going to do when the man opens up the back of the van. Are you going to fight him? What are you going to do?" I then decided when he opened up the van, I would play dead or passed out. From the heat, that is, so that he might try and revive me. Hopefully, if I was lucky, he might remove the rope around my legs and hands, and then I would just kick him hard in the groin and run away as fast as I possibly could. Everything would ultimately depend on how he chose to react to me when I played dead. It was mind-blowingly hot in the back of the van. Let's not kid, the weather was brutally ungenerous. The sweat was literally pouring down my body in rivers. It was sliding down my legs in long watery trickles. Truly, I was baking in the back of the van like a chicken. It was intolerable. Maybe I could use this merciless, unrelenting heat to my advantage. I'm not sure what time it was. I knew it was night, and we had been driving for quite some time. So it was away from New York, in some rural, remote area. I was so grateful I was wearing sneakers. I had changed into them at the office. As my sweaty feet had been sliding around my sandals, I had pulled out the sneakers from my gym bag, which was a stroke of luck. If I had been wearing those sandals, I would be in an even worse pickle. Finally, the van came to a standstill. I held my breath. I prepared myself for the performance of a lifetime. I could hear the man pull up his handbrake. The music he'd been playing the whole journey was a hideous, beating heavy metal. It had been blaring loudly. He turned the music off. He opened his door, slamming it loudly behind him. He finally walked to the back of the van and pulled open the door. I lay there with my eyes glazed, staring vacantly up into space as though dead. He looked at me, moved my sagging body. I didn't even flinch. I heard him say, "Bloody shit!" He tried to shake me. I flopped back like a rag doll. He then pulled the ribbon of tape quickly off my mouth. He tugged the rope off my hands and legs. He began to try and prop me up and to almost revitalize me. I couldn't believe it. He'd removed the rope from my hands and feet. My trick had worked. What a complete idiot! I deliberately rolled my eyes in the back of my head and breathlessly said, "Water! Water! So hot! So hot!" I looked like I was about to drop dead. So alarmed, he went to the front of the van, thinking I was going to peg it in any minute. And if he wanted to keep me alive, he needed to saturate my lips with water quickly. I'm in no doubt he had heard the news reports about people dying in this heat wave. It was reasonable to think I was about to pop my clogs in any minute. The moment he went to the front of his car to retrieve a water bottle, I legged it out of that van faster than a March hare, with my adrenaline coursing through my veins. Believe me, this adrenal response can give you a distinct edge when you're running for your life, as opposed to just chasing something. I could feel my legs running effortlessly, lightly over the tumultuous grassy terrain. It was dark outside. The ivory moon and the silvery stars were obscured, as the rising humidity had blocked out the light, as water absorbs light. We were in an isolated location without a solitary soul in sight. All there was turf, rocks, a plethora of trees that extended out into a vast sprawling wood grove that looked like it stretched out for an eternity, like a ceaseless ocean. But I knew in my heart those trees were my refuge, my saving grace, as they would offer me sanctuary, possibly a hiding place if I could outsmart this duplicitous man. "You bitch!" he screamed. "You bloody, bloody bitch! Wait until I get my hands on you!" He had realized I'd been play-acting and began running after me. He'd gone back to his truck to get a torch and his revolver, so those delays were to my advantage. Thankfully, he was not terribly fit. He might have been strong, but fit he was not, and he was slightly overweight and was breathing heavily as he ran after me. He was not giving up on me. His determination was ruthlessly fierce, his mind sharply focused, his intentions insanely evil. I ran so fast, my heart was buried beneath my chest. It thumped like a heavy drum. My breath was fast, laboured, exceedingly fatigued. I entered this woods and I could feel my clothes were saturated and soaked by my own sweat. Thankfully the woodgrove was cool and refreshing. The relief under the shade of these towering trees was immense. Where to hide? That was the quintessential question. I found a substantially tall tree with a hefty wide trunk on the edge of the woods, hemmed in by the thorny briars of spiky barbed shrubbery. I didn't care if I got ripped to pieces, as the man would hardly think I would likely hide among the thorns. I could feel the cuts and grazes lash out aggressively on my skin as the thorns ripped at my flesh, the blood trickling down my body, mixing with my sweat. I could even taste its saltiness on my tongue. I buried myself between the thorn bush and the tree, but truly with the adrenaline surging through my bloodstream, I felt no pain. I could feel my heart still pulsating loudly in my ears as the bright light of this man's torch began hovering all over the woodgrove. Its light beams settled and hovered attentively over ferns, rocks, shrubbery and trees, while I made myself as small and inconspicuous as possible.
"You bloody bitch!" I could hear his voice. "I'll find you. I'll bloody kill you. You're not going to escape. I'll get you, bitch. I'll get you. I'm not leaving this forest until I find you."
I was breathing heavily, panting like an exhausted, overheated dog, trying as hard as I could to be as quiet as possible. All of a sudden I felt a firm hand pressing lightly upon my shoulders. "Oh my God," I thought, "it's him!" I nearly jumped out of my skin, almost screamed like a banshee. My eyes adjusted to the dark and settled on this dense, tenebrous humanoid silhouette. In a trice, as if by magic, a trickle of moonlight dappled this kind human-like face that I realized belonged to a Bigfoot. Everything was getting more outlandish and bizarre by the minute. It was hard not to believe I was playing a role in an incredulous movie to be shown at the box office, but everything unfolding before me was undisputably real. This Bigfoot was humongous in size, girth and weight, built like an army tank with incongruous dainty-like breasts, a very reassuring matriarch feminine energy. She looked at me, put a finger on her lips, as if telling me to be very quiet, while her eyes remained staunchly fixed on my abductor. I could sense her indignance, her aggrieved, tense expression, that she did not like this man at all. I could see her body physically stiffen. Her oval jawline seemed to tense, rather like when a dog reacts adversely when he senses an intrusive presence. Looking back, not only do I think she could read his energy like a book, but his mind as well, for she knew without a shadow of a doubt what his guileful intentions were. I could physically feel her intelligence, her outer worldly perception, that appeared to taste the environment with a tangible intuition. I've never beheld such clairvoyance before, which is impossible to describe to you. It was like she was filled with an all-knowing, sagacious wisdom, as if she knew exactly what was happening beyond a reasonable doubt. For a long moment she remained soundlessly still, like a tall, towering tree trunk, just watching the man with his torch hovering over the woodgrove. It would seem her tall, hair-covered body blended into the woodgrove like any other tree. I could hear the man's cursing voice, mouthing all kinds of obscene, sensuous obscenities towards me that are not for the faint of hearing. The Bigfoot began to growl, roar and snarl like a lion at a low frequency that was louder than a gas-powered lawnmower. The sound was really quite discomposing, but I was not afraid. I knew this Bigfoot was going to help me. I'd seen it in her kind eyes that looked at me reassuringly, as if to tell me she was here to rescue me. I heard the man saying, "What the fuck is that?"
And then he began frantically throwing his torchlight across the forest. It would seem his demeanour had shifted. He now looked frightened, as if he was worried there was a predator in his midst that was loitering in the dark shadows, waiting to pounce on him at any given moment. Then in a trice, the light of his torch hit the female Bigfoot, travelling up and down her body and face. I heard him say again, "What the fuck? Bloody hell!" as he saw the Bigfoot staring back at him with wide, hostile eyes that did not pack any punches. Without a doubt, in his unbridled terror, my heinous abductor began to back away, running backwards, waving his revolver threateningly, firing random shots to try and intimidate the Bigfoot. But the fearless Bigfoot was confident, assertively gliding directly towards him, as if she was floating on air. She moved so graciously like the wind, grabbing the man, who was cocking his revolver at her, trying to fire. But I think his revolver had jammed, which was incredibly fortunate. The Bigfoot grabbed his revolver from him, throwing it away so that it landed close to where I was hiding. I ran towards the revolver and grabbed it with both of my hands. I was pointing it at the man, but he didn't even notice me. His eyes were locked on the Bigfoot. He was saying, "Please no! Please no!" just like my friend had said to him in the parking lot moments before, when he had shown him no mercy and shot him at point-blank range. It would seem Karma was collecting her outstanding debts that were now well overdue. The Bigfoot lifted the man up by his collar, so he was dangling up in front of her like a doll, swinging backwards and forwards. She was staring viciously into his eyes, growling at him. He was crying again, "Please, no! Put me down! No!" The Bigfoot kept swinging him like a pendulum, backwards and forwards in her hands, until finally she had grown tired of this hideous thug. She plopped him on the ground in a vertical lion, where he landed on his feet on the earthen floor, in an upstanding position, his eyes round like a gog-eyed goldfish, his mouth wide open. He released a funny smell in the woodgrove, which I believe is the smell of fear. And yes, fear has a distinctive, aggressive, sweaty, very pungent smell. The Bigfoot unhesitantly, with one large, strong hand, twisted his head, plucking it off his body, as if she was decapitating a chicken, threw it across the woodgrove, until it rolled across the floor like a soccer ball, and then finally stopped. I'd never felt such relief in all my life. I dropped the man's revolver on the ground, grabbing his torch that was flashing its light on the earthen floor. The Bigfoot was looking at me so kindly. I heard her saying in my mind, "Evil man, black heart, he was going to kill you." I don't know what possessed me, but I ran into her arms. She held me while the tears continued to pour down my face, saturating her hair. I felt like a doll, so tiny, so petite, in her massive, comforting arms. The Bigfoot smelt amazing, not like the sulphurous smells often reported about in Bigfoot accounts. On the contrary, she smelt like the earth, a musky, pleasant smell. She patted my back gently. In the light of my torch, I could see this Bigfoot clearly. She was easily 8 foot tall, 700 pounds, 3 to 4 foot wide across the shoulders, with overlong arms, very powerful legs. Her head was low slung on her powerful shoulders. Her face, oh my word, it was so human, but very, very feminine. The Bigfoot's presence was warm and congenial. She pointed to my nasty cuts and attended to them with some leaves that she crushed on the inflamed skin. It felt soothing to the touch. The Bigfoot indicated for me to follow her. She led me to this road, while she waited for me behind a tree. A couple of cars went by, but the Bigfoot did not allow me to wave them down. She shook her head, and then another car came driving down the road. She nodded at me. I quickly waved the car down, and it stopped. There was a man in the car who looked so kind. When he saw me so cut up with bloodstains all over my body that was streaking my face and clothes, he said, "Get into the car now." I climbed in his car and waved to the Bigfoot, but she was already long gone. "Who were you waving to?" asked the man. "Oh, no one," I said. "What happened?" he asked. "You're all shredded up." "I was hiding in some brambles from an evil man that abducted me." "Where is he now?" "He's in the woods somewhere," I said.
I had no intention of telling him that a Bigfoot had killed the man. The police would find his body later, I was sure of that, and I was not going to tell them the part of my story involving the female Bigfoot, as I wanted to protect her, much as she had protected me. Well, I'll take you back to my parents' place, shall I? Then they'll clean you up. We'll call the police and take it from there, shall we? It turned out that the man who had picked me up was actually a nurse. He'd just finished a stint at the hospital much, much later than usual. I looked at the clock. It was 9:30 in the evening, and the road that the Bigfoot had led me to was often frequented with regular traffic until about 10:30. "Here we are," said the young man, pulling up this long driveway towards a delightful-looking farmhouse where his parents lived. The young man called Taylor phoned the police to tell them what I'd reported to him. They were sending officers to the Woodgrove to see if they could arrest the man, whom I already knew was dead, but I wasn't saying anything, nor would I ever. "You poor, poor thing," said Taylor's mother. "You look like you've been dragged through a hedge backwards." She made me some sweet tea laced with brandy, along with a steaming hot bath that smelt of lavender and geranium. She provided me with luxurious, soft, fluffy white towels and a pair of fresh pyjamas to wear. The hot bath was amazing. I soaked in it for ages. The blood and the sweat literally melted off my body, and the kind lady put me in an air-conditioned bedroom, and I sank back into the beautiful bed and fell fast asleep. I was startled when I woke up the following morning to find myself sitting up in a strange but very comfortable bedroom. I'd been so exhausted. I'd fallen fast asleep, but the bedside clock on the bedstand registered 10 to 12 in the afternoon. Had I really slept for this long, I wondered? I could hardly believe it. I pulled back the white curtains to find myself looking out on a beautiful meadow, with 3 horses frolicking happily in a field, with mesh-like masks worn over their eyes to keep the flies at bay. I could see the bright sunshine gleaming through a cobalt-blue sky, and got the sense that it was still searing hot outside, as some flowers in the field looked as if they were wilting under the strain of the heat. Yet in this fabulous bedroom I was so marvellously cool, as the air-conditioning was on. No wonder I'd slept like a baby. It was a very attractive room, painted in a pale mint green, with white curtains, white bed linen, and mint green comforters. And on the white wooden bedstand beside my bed was an ice bucket with a large bottle of fizzing grape juice perched inside the bucket, ready to be drunk. I immediately opened it and poured myself a glass. Oh, it was wonderful. I could see the clothes I'd worn the previous day had been washed and laundered and were hanging on the wardrobe on a hanger. Ever so slightly worse for wear, as I could see some ladders in the fabric caused by the thorns and briars from the bramble bush. I felt as if I was staying in a plush hotel. As I made my way out of the bedroom, I could hear soft voices in the living room, and my name being discussed. "Officer, she's absolutely exhausted. By all accounts, she had a harrowing night. The poor girl was scratched to pieces. She had to flee her abductor." "It's all right," I said, entering the living room. "I'm up and about now. I had a fabulous good night's sleep." "Are you sure you're all right, dear?" said the kind lady. "The officer has come to ask you questions." "I'm very sorry to inform you," said the officer, looking at me kindly, "but the man who abducted you killed 3 of your work colleagues." "I suspected as much," I said, my eyes misting over with tears. "I'm really going to miss my friends. You see," I explained, "when the man tied me up and threw me in the back of his van, my friends were challenging him, asking him why he'd thrown a woman in his trunk. That's when I heard the shots being fired. I heard Bobby begging for his life. I pretty much knew then that he was probably dead." "I know it's upsetting," said the officer. "I'm very sorry for your loss. Are you going to be all right?" "As well as can be expected in the circumstances." "Who is he, officer? The man that abducted me?" "A man we have been looking for quite a considerable period of time, who's been responsible for killing and sexually assaulting 3 other women, usually in the woods. It's a miracle you're alive. He shot your work colleagues as he did not want to get caught. I have to tell you, we found his van parked outside the Woodgrove, and his body was found decapitated in the woods. Do you think you know what happened to him at all?" "No, officer," I lied. I've absolutely no idea. I just ran from him. What do you think killed him? I asked. That is the very big mystery, said the officer. But whatever killed him yanked his head right off. My guess it was a bear, but that bear is a hero in my book. The man got what he deserved. He was treacherously evil. I've always believed in the death penalty, extinguishing the evil from this earth so that the rest of us can live in peace and in love. To cut a long story short, those kind people insisted I stay at their house for several days. The nurse's brother was a psychologist whom they thought I should talk to, and the long of the short is we both fell in love with each other, and the nice lady who looked after me that fateful night is now my mother-in-law. Isn't it strange how the world works out? I'll never forget the worst night of my life when 3 of my work colleagues selflessly came to my rescue and challenged a heinously evil man who ended up killing them in cold blood. So yes, there is evil in this world, but there is also a great deal of good that I found in my work colleagues, a protective female Bigfoot, a kind family member that took me into their care, and a wonderful kind husband that serendipitously emerged from this horrifying occurrence. And I believe anyone listening to my story, any of your listeners, are also among the good and the kind. So in the end, good trumps over evil every time, and karma catches up with those who have guileful intent. And that is very good news indeed. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, if you're listening to my story now, then I'm almost certainly dead. For if indeed I am not, then there would be absolutely no reason why you would be listening to this story at all. I'm not writing a diary with dates and times. I mean, what's the point of that? I'm writing my thoughts and feelings down upon paper. You see, I believe I'm going to die. I believe it will be very soon. I've been having premonitions concerning my impending death. These lucid, unambiguous dreams are so real. I wake up in a cold sweat. Sometimes my clothes are soaked, they're so wet. It's almost as if I've plunged them into a swimming pool, as you can literally wring them out. My mother was shaking me one morning to wake me up, as I could not stop screaming, while I was caught up in this prognostic nightmare, of which there seemed no escape. It's not just my palpable prognostications that make me certain I'm going to die, but it is this instinctive, conspicuous knowing deep down inside my gut, almost as if every cell in my entire body is fully aware of this inevitable reality, looming ever closer on the horizon of my life. I cannot see myself getting married one day or having children in the foreseeable future. For indeed, when I try to visualize my future, I see and feel nothing at all, which is hauntingly airy, disturbingly discomposing. For like any aspiring progressive young person, I hope to have a flourishing job one day, a comfortable home, a beautiful wife and kids. But I don't see it. I don't see it at all. I don't see myself, even as a single unmarried man, living in an apartment on my own either. Believe me, I try to close my eyes tightly. I try so desperately hard to visualize my wife one day. Imagine what she would possibly look like, what kind of a personality she would have. I draw blanks. My mind is all but an empty screen that fails to play any footage of a potential future back to me. Of course, I told my mother about my bleak prognosis for the future, or lack of it, so to speak, as I'm not going to deal with this inauspicious, bodeful experience all on my own. Luckily, I have a mother who's not at all superstitious. She's the most prudently practical, pragmatic, and unidealistic person I know. She has never believed in the supernatural realm, or in the meaning of dreams, nor does she see my sixth sense as a harbinger of doom. She thinks all that stuff is hocus-pocus stuff and nonsense, which is a huge relief for me. She tells me exactly what I want to hear. You see, I get great relief from basking in her reassuring words, wallowing in them with a hopeful appreciation, like a hippo in a watering hole in Africa. I want so desperately to believe she's right, and that the grim forecast for my lucid dream is just a terrible fictitious nightmare that will never happen or come into fruition. Oh, don't be ridiculous, my mother laughs. Honestly, Giles, you rarely have a huge inventive imagination. Where are all these nonsensical, preposterous ideas coming from? Oh, I bet you've been watching some of those ghastly Netflix movies. You youngsters these days get so ensnared in all this fictitious stuff. It's hardly a wonder you have explicit nightmares all the time. For goodness sake, if I watched what you watched, I doubt I would sleep at night at all. I'm sure I'd wake up in a cloud of sweat like you do. That movie you were watching the other day on the Jeepers Creepers movie with that horrendous monster sniffing people's bodies, devouring people so readily. I dread to think how you must be filling your head with such absurd, vacuous ideas. It's all so nonsensical, sweetheart. Of course you're not going to die, you silly Billy. She says this, ruffling my hair. You hear that, darling? She says, turning to my father, as she tosses the salad dressing into the leaves, and laughs brightly, flicking her long mane of blonde curls away from her face, with a nonchalant air. What's this about, darling? Says my father, reaching into the salad bowl and pinching some dressed leaves, which he pops into his mouth. Delicious, sweetheart, he says approvingly. You've got just the right amount of garlic in the dressing. Absolutely perfect. Our son here thinks he's about to pop his clogs any time soon. By all accounts, he's been having foreboding premonitions. Well, so he thinks, she laughs. My father laughs as well. Not at all concerned about my nightmares. He's reaching for more lettuce to toss into his mouth, which he chews appreciately. If he carries on like this, there won't be any salad for dinner. Premonitions are stuff and nonsense, son. You should know that, surely. You've probably been watching way too many horror movies, he tells me. My father, like my mother, is level-headed and down to earth. He works in offices in New York City, dealing with figures every single day of his life. His mind is factual and scientific. He's never had time for anything that's not based on fact. So dreams to him are just illusionary fictional impressions created in our mind to entertain us while we sleep, and nothing more than that. That's what I keep telling him, said my mother. You're a young man, Giles. You're 20 years old, for goodness sake, with your whole life ahead of you. You're healthy and strong. Of course you're not going to die. When I was your age, I never gave death a second thought. I believed I was invincible and would live through anything in the world. But for a young man like you to be so preoccupied with such a depressing, macabre subject, the mind simply boggles. I love those words. You're not going to die. I want to hear them over and over and over again. They're like a soothing antiseptic ointment to my troubled soul, momentarily ironing away my fears. But deep down in my gut, I know my parents are wrong. You see, underneath it all, I really do know I'm going to die. My girlfriend Miranda is not at all like my parents. When I told her about my lucid dream, she wasn't consoling like my mother was. Actually, she was the one that encouraged me actively to write my story down. You see, she believes my premonitions are accurate, that my mind is preparing me for my imminent death. I think we all know when we're going to die, she insists, pointing at the gut. Deep down in here, she says. Some of us, of course, choose to ignore it, pretend it's not there, but others listen. You're listening to your gut, Giles. You're courageous enough to acknowledge it. Most are not. This is not what I want to hear. I'm not remotely courageous. But Miranda doesn't sugarcoat anything. She's straight to the point about what she believes. I cling on to one hope, and that is she's frightfully wrong, and that my parents are absolutely right. Miranda talks about people who perceived they were going to die, and they did, like that rather famous case in South Africa where Oscar Pistorius shot his girlfriend in a toilet cubicle, claiming he thought she was an intruder. Reva Steenkamp knew she wasn't going to live a long life, she exclaims to me. She even told her mother as much, when she drew a picture as a little girl of a staircase to heaven. She knew on a subconscious, deep-down level she wasn't going to live to a ripe old age. My girlfriend's unfavourable words are scant comfort to me, But I do like the fact that she listens to me, pays attention, takes my soothsaying more seriously, without cynical disregard and sceptical contempt. "I believe you know when your time is up," she says, with an air of insouciant indifference. Miranda is not callous or unkind, just practical about death. It's not a subject that troubles her at all. She believes the soul never dies, we live forever. She's not bothered by it one little bit. Miranda knows a lot about death. She's read up and studied about it more than anyone else I know. She's researched thousands and thousands of near-death experiences from all around the world, from every religion, culture and ethnic background. She's investigated cases around the world of people who claim to remember their previous lifetimes with an uncanny accuracy. And this is all around the world, regardless of what religion they may be. She believes in God, Jesus and reincarnation. She told me that the Vatican has deliberately suppressed books in their ancient archives where Jesus talks about reincarnation. Even his disciples asked him if he was Elijah in a new body. She believes this is part of the agenda of manipulating the masses. She thinks our lives on earth are a school, and that we come back again and again to experience many lessons, and that God experiences life through us. I don't know whether I believe in reincarnation, or even in her views, although Miranda's arguments are very compelling, I must admit. But I'm pretty much on the fence about it. I don't really know what I believe, but I do believe in God and Jesus, so I have been praying continuously to live a long, full life. But unfortunately the feeling that my life is hanging by a shoestring keeps resurfacing again and again. I certainly hope I'm not depressing you telling you my story, for that is certainly not my objective. I also don't want you to feel sorry for me. That would be pathetic, for I'm certainly not looking for sympathy or pity. But I am looking for validation that I'm not losing my mind. Personally, for me, it feels exceedingly good to share my impressions with you. It helps put everything out there in a sense of perspective. I'm well aware in the West that we all too eagerly shove the subject of death under the carpet, avoid even talking about it. It makes us feel uneasy, while other cultures in the world are comfortable about the subject. Miranda is like that. So many find my girlfriend weird in this regard. But Miranda is fascinated by the things in life steeped in mystery, and death is one of those mysterious subjects that gets her every time. One of her favourite sayings is to always begin your life with the end in mind. "Do you think I can avoid dying?" I asked Miranda, hoping there is one way I could outsmart my impending death. I would be all right with dying at an old age, but dying like this in my early 20s without enjoying the fullness of my whole life ahead of me seems so desperately unfair. As you might expect, Miranda does not agree with me on this. She emphatically believes I would have made the decision to leave this earth school early, before I was even born. She thinks I would have fully discussed this in my soul contract with my guides. "You know what," she says, "I don't know about whether the time of our death is written to be an exact date or time, but I do know there are people who believe there are exit points in our lives when we can subconsciously choose to leave at the right time for our soul. I don't know the answers to that question. I certainly wish I did, but I'm not God. I could offer you comfort, Giles, tell you what you want to hear, but I'm certainly not going to do that. Suffice to say, my lamentable premonitions were always the same. It first started with an inauspicious, baleful feeling that something was watching me in my dream. It sent chills pulsating down my spine. All I knew was I wanted to run away as fast as I could. I could see myself being hemmed in from every direction by viridescent green vegetation that twinkled with the dew of raindrops. There were towering trees in my premonition that launched their vertical trunks into the heavens like tall, masterful skyscrapers that were so gargantuan and imposing you could see their leafy green heads that arched above me at a vast height to form a canopy. Soft twinkling shafts of sun danced through the bronze boughs, dappling the floor in an ethereal light, infusing the vegetation in contrasting hues and shades of green. I felt trapped and confined in the space, as if I couldn't breathe, as if something was sitting on top of my lungs, crushing my oxygen supply, so my very breath was expunged from me. I knew I needed to run, as there was no way out of this maze-like place, this sumptuous, lush, tropical oasis that was reminiscent of a rainforest. Regretfully, the beauty was confiscated by my fear. I was wearing a white loincloth, while my golden torso was naked. My feet were bare, as I walked on the earthen floor, or ran. I had been in this place before. It brought me solace and comfort, but not today. I could feel something was loitering in the dark shadows, stalking me. I could see a dark face, bright yellow eyes staring at me. Then I heard the low roar. It was a black leopard, pressing his paws on the ground, moving stealthily towards me. He pulled back his lips to expose his sharp, treacherous canine teeth. He roared and ran towards me, pouncing upon me. My body fell back on the earthen floor. I tried to scream, but I could not. The animal tore off my arm and began to eat it. Thankfully, the pain was anaesthetized by my shock and disbelief. I watched him tearing my flesh away from the bone, chewing every morsel of my arm. I could feel my arm throbbing. I became lightheaded as I lay there bleeding out, while the blood drained from my body, until I found myself floating, drifting away above the canopy. I could hear a female voice saying, "Your time is almost up. Not long now." I knew the message was for me. I had been forewarned that my life would soon be demanded from me. It would seem anyone whom I told my foreboding premonitions to shunned it as if it was just a silly dream, and much like my mother dismissed it as my overreactive imagination. But not Miranda. She was the only one who believed me, trusted in my word. The only one that sensed my message was a pregnant warning from beyond the grave, revealing to me of what soon was to be birthed or come to pass in my life. Then it happened one day, as me and my girlfriend had got on an escalator at Macy's in Fifth Avenue, with shopping bags in our hands. We'd been buying some winter gloves and scarves. We were both on that escalator. In a trice, a portentous, percussive feeling of anxiety overcame me, like the apprehension I'd experienced in my inauspicious nightmare. It was the exact same presentiment of trepidation, rather like a familiar song you hear playing on the radio. This foreboding sharpened my attention, alerting me to a sense of danger. My heart began thumping violently in my chest. I wanted to get off the escalator as quickly as I possibly could. The urgency was overwhelming and intense. Then it happened. I could hear a man's voice screaming, "Stop him! Stop him now! Don't let him get past!" This hefty man came bounding down the escalator and with one forceful thrust shoved me off the moving stairs, so I went stumbling over the stairs, landing headfirst on the floor below. He immediately ran over me, as if I was all but a slight obstacle in his path, and of little significance. The two police officers remained hot on his trail, racing directly after the man, while one officer, on seeing me lying there, stopped to call an ambulance. I lay there on the floor motionless, with my eyes seemingly glazed over. Miranda thought I was dead, as did many of the horrified bystanders who were visibly upset.
"Oh my God, he's dead!" people were saying. "He's dead! The man pushed him over and killed him!"
My girlfriend was anxiously leaning over me, assuring the worried gathering of people that there was still a faint pulse. The EMTs arrived on the scene. I was hurriedly thrown onto a gurney, pushed into an ambulance with my girlfriend holding my hand. I arrested in the back of the ambulance, but the EMTs efficiently brought me back from the precipice of death. I remember waking up in hospital to see the doctor hovering over my bed, smiling at me with a broad beam.
"I'm very happy to see you up, Giles. We had you in an induced coma for a while to bring down the swelling on your brain. It was touch and go for a moment. We almost lost you. Do you remember anything?" I shook my head. I had vague memories of voices in the background, people rushing around backwards and forwards. But other than that, my memories remained hazy and obscure, like a misty photograph upon which you failed to observe all the details. Both my normally stoic parents were now very panicked when they came to visit me in hospital. Their nonchalant, easygoing attitude had evaporated. Both of them looked weighted down with worry and anxiety. My close call with death had left them more than a little unhinged. "I told you, Mum," I said to her. "My premonition is coming true. The spirit of death is trying to take me away." "Oh, for goodness sake, don't be so ridiculous, Giles," said my mother. "Don't talk such nonsense." But her voice sounded strained, as if she was beginning to doubt her own words. "What happened, sweetheart?" she said, her forehead breaking out into worried furrows. "I don't understand." Please explain to me what happened. You were shopping at Macy's.
That's right. I was shopping at Macy's. A thug was escaping from the police. He pushed me off the escalator. I landed head first on the floor. The doc says it's amazing I didn't crack open my skull like an egg. It's a miracle, Mum, that I'm still alive. My mother took my hand in hers, giving it a tight, firm squeeze. You know what, darling? Maybe your dream was telling you that you would have a close call with death, but you're right as rain now, aren't you? You didn't die, did you? There you are. I told you that you wouldn't die. I was right. I read somewhere that the most things we fear, well, most of them, don't come true at all. I also believe lightning does not strike in the same place twice. What do you think? She said, turning to my father.
I think all this negative talk of dying is preoccupying your mind, son. It's what you think about all the time. It's not healthy. Maybe focusing on death so much made you will this accident to happen.
I wanted to believe my parents were right. I really did. I clung on to their belief system like a person stranded out on the ocean, clinging to a lifeboat, hanging on to the desperate hope that they will be rescued. But somewhere deep down in their gut, they knew that help was not forthcoming. So yes, I was using my parents' words, rather like lifeboats that I could cling to. It was awfully convenient. My mother had said that my premonition was just warning me of something that never happened, nor would ever come to pass, while my father thought I'd willed my accident to manifest in my reality. So why is it that the ominous reoccurring vision kept returning over and over again? I did not believe the forest or the black leopard were literal interpretations of the premonition, not at all. I thought they were symbolic messages of a destiny I couldn't avoid. My mother was now waking me up regularly when I would be screaming in my bed, claiming I'd experienced yet another horrifying forecast. My mother grabbed my hand, squeezing it tight. I noticed her normally long nails had been bitten to the core, that her relaxed demeanour was much more stressed out, as if she was finally taking my premonitions more seriously and giving them more credence. "I don't understand why you keep having these dreadful dreams," she said to me. "Surely there's something we can do about it. I was thinking you could go and speak to a therapist. It's not good living with this dark cloud hanging over your life like this. You surely realise that lots of people have nightmares where they see themselves falling down a cliff, but nothing bad ever happens to them." "I've had nightmares before, Mum. They've never troubled me. But this is different. It's hard to explain. It's like a heightened intuition telling me to pay attention, or like a book telling me what is written in the next chapter. It's most unfortunate that you feel as if your life is running out. It worries me that you are so insistent about this, darling. You really must live every day to the fullest. After all, is not our life meant to be happy? The truth is, darling, we're all in exactly the same boat. You, me, your father, everybody in the entire world. We wake up every morning, regardless of our age or culture, with the same risk of dying every day, as accidents do happen to us. None of us are immune to this grisly fact. Sometimes people are at the right place at the wrong time and are run over by a bus. It does happen. But dwelling over what could be is futile. It's toxic to your health. I was reflecting about my mother's words for a moment. She had certainly made some good points. But supposing, Mum, the person run over by the bus, hypothetically, was at the right place at the right time, because they were meant to be run over by that bus. And if the bus didn't take them, something else would, as they were predestined to die, like I nearly died on the escalator at Macy's, but I didn't. So maybe some other anomalous, unlikely event might take me next time. Like that movie, Final Destination. Do you remember that one? "Darling, you're scaring me again," said my mother. "I'm going to organise a therapist for you at once. We simply can't continue to live in this gloomy environment as a family for a moment longer. Dwelling on such macabre thoughts daily is not right for someone so young. It's effectively destroying the household. Look at me, I've started to bite my nails. The last time I did this was over exams at school. I was sure I would fail, but I didn't, of course. My depressing outlook was consuming me, as is yours. We need to sort this out. No son of mine should be going through this kind of stress. You need to talk to someone about these insane dark thoughts of yours." So yes, my mother did take me to a therapist. Mrs. Piper, the therapist I went to see, was one of these people as dismissive about dreams, nightmares and premonitions like my mother had been. She studied me through her astute brown eyes and said, "Giles, I think what we're dealing with here is a profound fear of death. You'd be surprised to know that just like a fear of spiders or snakes, I counsel many clients who visit me regularly for counselling who have a terror of dying. I have agoraphobic clients who are afraid of leaving their homes as they think that something terrible is going to happen to them. It's this intrinsic fear that unfortunately hijacks their lives. In your case, you need to address this fear you're having of dying. If we don't, it could cripple your daily routines, rob you of living a normal, productive, enjoyable life, confiscate your freedom, steal your confidence. You're feeling insecure, vulnerable and afraid. We need to tackle this fear head on and face it." "Look, Mrs. Piper," I exclaimed, "I'm not afraid of death, if that's what you think. I know it happens to us all. I just believe I'm going to die soon, and that my dream is a warning premonition. What you don't get is death is not actually a fear of mine. I'm not afraid to live my life or to leave my house every day, embracing my normal daily routines. Not at all. I'm not even worried if I'm run over by a bus. That doesn't really matter to me, nor does it trouble me a jot. I don't look over my shoulder worrying about my imminent death. But you do have a fear of this premonition of yours, do you not?" "I don't have a fear of the premonition itself. But your mother says you wake up in a cold sweat, that you're screaming your lungs out. It's because I'm reacting to the fear the dream instills in me. At the time, the dream is so hauntingly real, it's as if I'm caught up in a frightening situation from which I can't escape. That is what terrifies me." "All right," said Mrs. Piper. "Look at it in another perspective, will you then, Giles? Hypothetically speaking, if this premonition were indeed true, what do you feel about the message it conveys to you?" "I'm not bothered about dying, Mrs. Piper, as I keep reiterating, if that's what you're getting at, but I'm bothered about my life being cut short. You see, I can't see a future for myself, even if I try my damnedest to visualize one. I can't see it," I said, pointing to my gut. "I have the sagacious intuitive knowing that I know I'm not on this earth for a long time, with every fibre of my being, as if a divine intelligence, or God himself if you like, is foretelling my journey ahead, or lack of it, so to speak." "So you're scared of what you think you know is your ultimate outcome?" "No, I'm not scared. I'm disappointed, very disappointed, because I want to have a full life, not one fortuitously shortened." "Well, then that's what you must do. Why do you not allow this premonition to abandon your mind? You're allowing it to consume your focus. Instead of enjoying yourself, you're thinking about your premonition over and over again. It's overtaking your life like a dark cloud that won't leave you alone." I reflected on what the therapist was saying to me. I knew she was absolutely right. My premonition was definitely stealing my joy, for I thought about little else. It entertained my imaginings night and day. I carried it with me wherever I went, like a heavy bag of books that was wearing me down, eroding my happiness, pounding away at my mind like a woodpecker hammering the trunk of a tree with its determined beak. I needed to let it go, like a hot air balloon on the wind. I needed to release my disappointment, along with the ill-boding message it contained. "You know, Giles," said Mrs. Piper, "supposing your premonition were true for a moment, I'd like you to entertain that possibility for a second. You'd be no different to a youngster in a hospital bed being told by their doctor that they didn't have very long to live. You would have to face your death, knowing it was around the very next corner. You'd have to make peace with that knowledge. If you were that cancer patient, what would you do? Put yourself in their shoes for a moment. Imagine the doc saying, 'Son, you're dying. There's not much time left. We can't do anything more for you now.'" I thought about it for a moment. "Well, I'd want to do as many wonderful things as I could before I died. I'd want to make the most of every single day. I wouldn't allow myself to think about death a moment longer. Even if I had nightmares about it, I would ignore them." "Exactly. So you must do the very same." I realized that going to see Mrs. Piper was the best decision my mother could have ever made on my behalf. For instead of discussing my premonition, I chose to ignore it completely. I refused to give it house room. I began to live my life to the fullest, never certain about what each day would hold, but not worrying about its prognosis either. I mean, what was the point? On the next session with my therapist, she got some hot air balloons for me, and we put the elements of my forebodings on the balloons. I wrote black leopard on one balloon with a black marker pen, releasing the balloon up into the heavenlies. I put rainforest on another balloon, anxiety on another, disappointment on the other, foreboding, grief, loss, frustration, nightmares, premonitions, lucid dreams on all the other balloons, releasing each and every one up into the sky, watching them all float away until they were finally gone. It felt so liberating. We were letting go of everything that had relentlessly beheld my attention and focus. Mrs. Piper asked me to speak to my premonition, and I did. I addressed it personally. I said, "Mr. Premonition, I acknowledge your message. I receive it, although I will not entertain it. However, I would like you to leave me alone. I don't want you to return again. You are no longer welcome in my life. I would urge you to go and not come back again."
"See, well done, Giles. Your premonition has gone," said Mrs. Piper. "Now just go out and live your life. Enjoy yourself."
Ostensibly a funny thing did happen. After addressing my premonition, releasing all the balloons and the lucid forebodings and nightly visions, just left. Even my mother stopped biting her nails again, and I was no longer walking on eggshells or screaming in the middle of the night, and a peaceful acceptance of whatever the future may or may not hold for me. Miranda's story. My boyfriend Giles was never a really spiritual person, so when he first began talking about his premonition, I was bewildered. I certainly was surprised about his insistence that he was going to die soon. I remember him saying, "Miranda, I know I'm going to die." When he announced this, and that he couldn't envisage a future or imagine himself being married, I took him at his word. You see, I've always believed in reincarnation. I thought Giles was remembering a part of his soul contract that he'd discussed with his guides before he was born, when he had agreed for his life to be cut short in this lifetime. I know a lot of deeply religious people who would argue with me tirelessly about this, and they do. They will insist reincarnation is not a part of our lives. But how can they know the deepest mysteries that life entails for us? In my opinion, reincarnation explains a lot. Why do some babies die in childbirth and are denied a life? It would make our human experience exceedingly unfair. But this would not be the case if we had many lifetimes. Do I believe in God and Jesus? Yes, I emphatically do. I do believe, based on a lot of my research, that much of the Bible has been hidden from us for the purposes of a manipulative agenda by the powers that be. That's my humble opinion. Whether it's right or wrong doesn't really matter. I feel that Giles's premonition was revealing to him that time was almost up for him. Most of us don't remember our soul contracts. We're not meant to. But I believe he'd remembered his, or at least his subconscious mind was reminding him of it. Of course, his parents were highly dismissive about his revelations, believing that he was just experiencing a lucid nightmare, and that was all it was, and they would never amount to anything. Although I will agree that a lot of fears never do come to pass. I wasn't so sure about Giles's case. Of course, when Giles had this random accident at Macy's on Fifth Avenue in New York, his parents began to take him more seriously. It would seem that he came a hair's breadth away from losing his life that day. Even the doctors affirmed it was a miracle he was alive. I was in the ambulance that day, when he went into cardiac arrest. Believe me, it was touch and go for a while. We so nearly lost him. I did wonder if that could have been one of his possible exit points in his soul contract, where he would leave this world. It had been a close call, far too close for comfort, I regret to say. I do remember his mother asking me what I thought. I told her I believed premonitions were real, not all of them, but some of them. People had them all over the world. Sometimes people sensed a family relative was going to die, and it happened. Or they knew that they shouldn't take that flight, or something bad would happen, and those warning premonitions came to pass, sometimes saving their lives. I certainly know when the 9/11 disaster happened, many highly intuitive people never went to work that day, instinctively listening to their bodeful warnings in their guts. Something was going to go horribly awry. So that fact made them pay attention, and they didn't go to work that day, which may well have saved their lives. It was then that Giles's mother confided something in me. I knew she wanted to share her troubles with me. "Please don't tell Giles I'm telling you this," she said to me. "But I did try to imagine my son married with children. But I couldn't visualize that scenario, as hard as I tried. It scared the hell out of me. You see, I could easily envisage my daughter married, but not Giles. What do you think about that? What do you suppose that means?" I told her. I feel exactly the same way. I tried to imagine Giles married with children myself. The images didn't flow naturally into my imagination. They did so with great difficulty. "All we need to do is enjoy our lives," I told her. "I think we should take Giles's premonition as a gift to us. I mean, how many parents who lose their children would have done things so differently if they had known how fleeting their child's lives would actually be? They would spend as much quality time as possible with the child that was about to die, would they not?" "You know, Miranda, you're absolutely right," she said, kissing me lightly on the forehead with her lips. "Thanks for that. Thanks for talking sense to me. From now on, I'm going to make it my mission to spend more time with my son, just in case his premonition is true." It would seem Giles relinquished his former agitations. He began to thoroughly enjoy his life. There was a distinctive skip in his step, a mischievous, naughty twinkle in his eyes. His laughter filtered through the atmosphere daily, as he made up some rather ludicrous jokes that we thoroughly enjoyed. Ostensibly, a wonderful thing had metamorphosized in his life. The heavy forebodings had been lifted off him, that had so preoccupied his focus like a demanding toddler screaming to be heard. It had completely gone. It would seem Giles refused to give those hassling thoughts house room, so the harrowing nightmares dissipated like the steaming vapour from a boiled kettle, or like the dying embers of a fire, until they were no more. Giles was very eager to explore the natural world again. I'd heard of transfixing woodland trails outside of New York, where we could go hiking. When most people think of New York, they think of a vibrant, bustling city, and that's true, of course, but there is so much more to New York than meets the eye. Many people fail to realize there are lots of areas around New York that are distinctly rural, with a plethora of rich forests, especially if you fancy poking around villages and towns full of rustic charm. It has everything from cycling in the Adirondack Mountains or scuba diving in Long Island South. Believe it or not, 61% of the state is heavily forested. Most of the forests are made up primarily of oak, hickory, tulip and sweet gum trees. So parts of New York rural? Most definitely yes. After Giles had decided to live every day to the fullest, we began spending a lot of time in nature, exploring woodland areas outside of New York. But this was the day I will account to you when Giles's premonition came sadly to pass. It had started like any normal day. There was nothing about that day that sang out to me with a sense of foreboding that this day was going to be different to any other. But I assure you, it most certainly was. Giles and I had decided to go for a hike in a pretty woodland area, outside a rustic town. I'd packed us a delectable picnic lunch. We parked my car in the town, heading towards the woodland trail, usually accessed by many dog walkers, hikers and mountain cyclists alike. But not on this day. The trail was exceedingly quiet for some reason, unusually so, as we didn't see a single solitary soul accessing the woods that day. It was a beautiful day. Soft shafts of twinkling sunlight cast a scattering of light droplets through the bronze boughs of the trees, peppering the fauna and flora with prisms of colourful light, like you might get when a sunlight beam is broken up against a crystal pendant. So pretty rainbows of this colourful flickering light, in shades of purple, pink, blue and yellow, danced over the forest so magically. The trees in this woodland sanctuary were primary hickory and oak. They stood up proud and tall, with weighty girths, masterful, imposing, full, tall boughs, reaching up high in the canopy above our heads, selectively deciding how much light was permitted to steal its way through the branches. This sumptuous congenial oasis was covered with green shrubs, pretty woodland flowers, feathery ferns, resplendent verdant moss, carpeting rocks, bark, and areas of the dark earthen floor. We listened to the woodland birds chirping, watched squirrels darting up trees. We laughed and talked together as we ambled happily down a long, winding, precipitous trail.
In a trice, things became eerily quiet. It was more than a little bizarre. One moment everything was alive, enchanting, charming, with the tweets and warbles of birds. Then it was as if the forest was on mute, as if silence had been dutifully demanded of it. It was in this soundless silence that an unsettled feeling overcame me. The peaceful ambience I had thoroughly enjoyed moments before had been unfairly extinguished. Chills darted down my spine. I disturbedly sensed that something quite dreadful was loitering in the dark shadows. It was watching us with voracious eyes that seared our flesh like burning coals of invasive scrutiny. I glanced around the immediate area briefly, but I saw nothing. There was a sizable presence close to us. I could feel the heartbeat of the woods had distinctly changed. It had become heavier, torrid, clammy, airless, suffocatingly oppressive. Very disquieting. "Oh, my God," said Giles, "this is just like my dream when the black leopard is stalking me. I have this discomposing feeling all over again. That also overcame me when I was on that escalators at Macy's. But this is so much worse." "Look," I said, putting a comforting hand on him, "let's get out of here now. I feel unsettled too. Everything has gone quiet. I feel something morose is watching us in the shadows. This is our cue to leave. I don't feel welcome here any more. Something's not right." "You know what," said Giles, "it's probably nothing. We're overreacting, that's all. Remember what my therapist taught me, to embrace every single day. I cannot allow a little trepidation, a few ambiguous, ambivalent feelings to upset me or ruffle my feathers, can I? We're planning to have a picnic in the woodgrove. I'll be damned if I allow this paranoia to monopolise or overwhelm me. I told you I refuse to live like that any more." "But it isn't paranoia," I insisted. "It's a gut instinct telling us to go now, to leave." All of a sudden, before I could protest any further, we heard a low guttural growl. "Did you hear that?" I asked Giles. He nodded. I could see the colour had literally faded from his face. It became ghostly white. I noticed even his eyes widened, and he said again, "Oh, my God, Miranda, this is exactly like my premonition I told you about. Oh, my word, every detail is coming true. Let's get out of here now before it's too late." We were about to turn around to retreat from whence we'd come, when we heard a cracking sound, almost as if someone was breaking a tree bough deliberately with their feet. A lonesome twig broke off the oak tree, floating to the ground, landing pointingly on Giles's sneaker. We both swiftly craned our heads ever upwards to stare at the upper boughs of the oak tree. I nearly fainted from shock, for what I saw was possibly the most terrifying thing that my eyes have ever beheld. I had to look away for a brief second to return my gaze. I was almost certain that this was a delusional trick of the light. I couldn't be seeing what I thought I was seeing. Surely not. I glanced up at the tree branch again. Standing there on the branch, larger than life, was the most vile-looking creature, of about 7 foot tall, covered in long flowing black hair, with a dog-like muzzle, sharp canine teeth, hostile deep-set dark eyes that gave off a red eye-shine. He looked like a demon humanoid dog, for he stood up on 2 feet, appearing bipedal. I wasn't sure if this was a Bigfoot or not, as he did have human-like hands and feet, with sharp talons for nails, not a flat nail bed. The head was shaped like a dog or a wolf, and he had a long tail that was thick and bushy, rather like an Alsatian. It twitched all the time, much like his nostrils did, and he breathed like a horse. I think Bigfoots are supposed to be like an ape, aren't they? But it could have been a Bigfoot. I'm not perfectly sure about that. He was the most petrifying thing my eyes have ever beheld before, grotesquely evil in every way. He thoroughly enjoyed the terror we exhibited, almost as if our fear was giving him a physical high. He was rather like something you'd expect to see on a brilliant costumed horror movie designed to perfection by Universal Studios. Only this entity was real. He was not fictitious. It was like he was toying with us as he threw down a couple more twigs from the upper branches towards us on the ground. We both flinched. I swear to you he laughed at us. "Run! Run! Run, Miranda! You go ahead of me, quickly, and I'll follow you. My legs felt like dead weights beneath me, as if all the energy they contained was now estranged from me. I pushed through this immobile concrete-like resistance that I experienced in my legs. Then I began to run. I could see Giles was running too, behind me. I looked back and stopped briefly, as the creature had jumped off the tree branch, just like a tabby cat, landing on the forest floor with a fluid buoyancy, and then he grabbed Giles by the collar of his shirt, with no trouble at all. Giles let out a scream as the creature tossed him in the air like a tennis ball, thoroughly enjoying his screams. They seemed to incite excitement within him. I picked up stones from the earthen ground, throwing them at the creature, screaming, "Get off my boyfriend! Leave him alone! Get off him! Stop it! Stop it!" But he ignored me. He didn't care about me at all. He began pulling off Giles's arm, and it came off. He just ripped it off. Then I could see Giles watching the creature. His eyes began to fade. He was calling to me, "Miranda, I love you. Be safe. Tell the parents I love them. Not to be sad." Then his words seemed to trickle away, rather like the rain flowing down a glass pane, and he drifted into unconsciousness. Then he died in 4 minutes flat. The creature continued to look at me, perched on the tree trunk, eating Giles's arm, as if it was a delicious chicken drumstick. He thoroughly enjoyed my horrified reaction. I just hightailed it out of there as fast as I possibly could. I couldn't watch any more. To cut a long story short, after the police arrived on the scene, Giles was found on the earthen floor, minus one arm and minus one leg, but the creature had long since gone. I certainly did not tell the police what I'd seen. I said that something black had chased us through the woods, and I hadn't seen what it was. I was not going to have the police think I was some weirdo, but I know what I saw, and I was not mistaken, for my eyes did not deceive me. Of course, his family was devastated about his untimely death, as was I, but we could not dismiss that Giles's premonition was startlingly accurate, so whether his time was up, based on a spiritual soul contract, I'll leave that for you to decide. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah and all your listeners, my name is Sophia and I'm Hispanic and come from Quintana in the Bronx, so I guess you know now that I am from a family where poverty was my middle name. Growing up in the Bronx in New York in the early 90s was far from easy. I was 15 at the time and the area was full of drug addicts, hustlers, drunks, criminals, gangsters, and every lowlife that you could imagine. Do not get me wrong, there were decent people living there, to be sure, but the area did attract some of life's less desirable characters, which is often the case in areas where impoverishment is rife. My mother would always make sure we were back in our tiny little apartment by 5 o'clock every day, and that our front door was double bolted. During the night, things went on in the Bronx that were not for the faint-hearted. Sometimes we would hear in our apartment blocks huge screams, shouting, and people arguing and fighting. There would be gunshots on occasion, ambulance sirens, and police cars on a regular basis, usually waking us up at ungodly hours of the night. Sometimes I would stare out of our apartment window in my pyjamas, and on a few occasions I would actually see ambulances putting deceased bodies onto gurneys in the back of their vans and driving away. It truly was a formidable existence, but I grew up in this dog-eat-dog world, and it was all that I knew. No one longed to escape this lifestyle more than my mother Maria, who worked as a cleaner for some offices in the city and earned a very meagre wage. My dad had been killed a few years earlier by a gang leader who mistook my father for a rival gangster who was the splitting image of my dad. It was a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and it was an unfortunate tragedy that made our family sink into greater depths of poverty. There were times when we barely had enough to eat, but my mother knew a baker's who threw out their old doughnuts and cakes at the end of a day, and so sometimes she would do some dumpster diving, and some of the stuff that she recovered was still very good and tasty. My mother also brought all our clothes from second-hand thrift shops. One thing my mother also did, with huge conviction, was buy regular lottery tickets.
This had incensed my dad when he was alive, because he said we were making the rich richer by buying these tickets, and that buying tickets made the poor poorer. My mother refused to listen because, like Charlie in the chocolate factory, my mother believed in a golden lottery ticket that could change our lives forever. And I have to hand it to her because her faith was relentless, despite the protests of my father. When we were out of these slums, she would say, "When I've won a lottery ticket for us, we'll be moving to Kentucky." "Why Kentucky?" I'd ask her. "That's hardly Hispanic." "Because we will live in a cabin with lots of land and raise our own chickens and have a couple of horses. It's my dream," she would say. I'm afraid I never believed my mother would win the lottery when I lived in a hostile world where girls my age were falling pregnant and people were getting caught up in drugs and crime. One day my mother came home from her job as a cleaner, and she told us that she had resigned from her job. Her face seemed to gleam with a radiance I had never seen before. Our hearts sank because no job invariably meant no food. But suddenly my mother informed us that we were moving to Kentucky because she'd won the lottery and our lives were about to change. I know that movies make out that when you win the lottery, that you jump up and down for joy and you go crazy and hug each other and dance around your living room screaming. That's the movies for you, but it's not real life. Our family did not react that way because it was so hard to grasp a life that was away from the Bronx. It was the only life that we had ever known growing up, and winning the lottery was so surreal for us. It was almost like we were waiting to hear the very bad news. "Sorry, we got it wrong. You didn't actually win." We lived in an environment where we were so used to nasty people saying mean, unkind things and being intentionally horrible to us that we never knew that there was a kinder world out there where you did not have to fight every day just to survive. We were used to living in a shark-infested tank, so being tough was a way of life for us. Fast forward to the day we moved to our cabin in Kentucky. I remember we just literally up and left the Bronx without our worldly possessions because basically we had none. My mother had ordered beautiful furnishings for our home so that it was transformed into a cozy palace. Well, that's what it seemed like to us because we'd grown up with the most basic of human requirements, so anything else seemed like paradise and bliss for us. Our cabin was situated in a remote area of Kentucky and was on 200 acres of pristine land that unbelievably all belonged to us. Our home overlooked the most serene purple-blue mountainous valleys and areas of forest that stretched back for an eternity and beyond. We had a large silvery lake on our property that was teeming with bird life like waterfowls and ducks, and we also had our own wooded area that belonged to us and would have been every hunter's dream, as we were told it was full of deer, turkey, hogs, and all kinds of wildlife, which inevitably we began to enjoy as we watched those creatures drinking from our lake. I remember the first day at my new home, when I sat and watched the sun set in its golden and pink hues, and for the first time in my 15 years, my heart melted in awe as I suddenly realized how truly privileged I was to be living in such a breathtakingly beautiful place. It was all like a beautiful dream that I was so terrified I would wake up from to find it was not real. But the upside of this dream was that there was no downside, and we were really living in a golden lottery ticket my mother had envisaged for so long. I had no idea how much my mother won on the state lottery because she never told us, and that was probably a good idea. We were also told never to tell anyone about our lottery win or that we previously came from the Bronx, because people might look down on us like a form of lower pond life that didn't deserve to live in such a glorious place. So we always told people we were from New York, but we lied about whereabouts we actually came from. We did meet many of our neighbours who welcomed us to our new home and brought us gifts like apple pies and fresh milk and cream. Initially we were suspicious of the people we met because I'd grown up never trusting a single soul, because there was something so charming and sincere about these warm, friendly people. They appeared so different from the people in the Bronx. Now, I don't want to tar everyone in the Bronx with a bad brush, because as I said before, not everyone living there is up to no good. There are good people living there, and lots of them too, like my mother Maria, who have no choice but to survive in a shark-infested world that is hardly their choice. As you can imagine, we were very naive about country life and were clueless about absolutely everything. It was like we had to start from scratch. We knew nothing about fishing and hunting and predators or wild animals. We knew nothing about the soil and growing things, and even encountering insects like bees and butterflies, frogs, tadpoles and worms was a whole new world of discovery for us, which I imagine country folk just took for granted. For us, our level of understanding about the natural world was very impaired, as we had no experience of it. When you have lived in poverty all your life and have worn someone's cast-offs since you were a baby, it's a whole new experience adjusting to new clothes, food in the cabinets or fridge when you're hungry, and a place that is so serene and peaceful instead of the dreadful sound of two gangsters having a brawl. It was a world apart from what we had been known, but it was a world that both excited and intrigued us. One Sunday afternoon, when I had tons of homework to do and some chores around the house, the thought of doing so much work made me want to take a nap. I was great at the art of procrastination and loved to avoid anything that was both boring and required a great deal of meaningless physical exertion, like the drudgery of housework or even cooking. When Angeline, my younger sister, saw me napping, she persuaded me to take a walk into the woods with her. It was about 3 p.m, and it was early fall, and we had been meaning to explore the woods for a very long time, but with schoolwork, chores, and settling into a brand new home, we'd simply had no time to go exploring. It was crazy because we owned all this lovely land, and we did not fully know what we owned, if that makes any sense to you at all. A walk sounded like a great opportunity to engage in some further procrastination, and if I was out enjoying the woods with my sister, my mother would not be piling on all her pressure for me to finish my boring math assignment and my science project. "Can you believe we own all this?" I said to my sister as we approached the woods. It was almost impossible to believe. "I still remember the day Mum told us she'd won the lottery," said my sister. "It just seemed impossible to believe that something this good actually happened to us." "I know what you mean," I said. "I never expected anything good to come our way, especially after Dad was killed." "Don't talk about that," said my sister. "Let's never talk about the Bronx again. We have a whole new life now. Let's enjoy it." As we approached the forest, we eagerly bounded into an area with tall, majestic-looking trees and floors carpeted with thick layers of leaf litter. We watched several woodpeckers in a group pecking at a large tree, and we caught a glimpse of a squirrel eyeing us curiously as he appeared to be nibbling something. "Oh, he's so cute," I explained in delight. "My friend at school says her father goes shooting squirrels." "That's terrible," I said. "How could anyone kill something this sweet?" "Well, they're country folk," said my sister. "They do things differently out here." Suddenly my sister stopped for a moment and looked at me with a puzzled look on her face. "Smell that," she said to me. "It smells strangely familiar, like a rotting corpse." It reminded me of the dreadful smell we had smelt once while living at the Bronx. An old man had sadly died alone on his toilet, and the smell caused the police to investigate and break down his door. It was the most god-awful, sweet, sickly smell that I'd ever smelt in my entire life, and one I would never forget. I remember that smell lingered around the place for ages, and words cannot describe how foul it was. My mother had brought a dozen air fresheners just to make our lives more bearable. The smell we were smelling now was a lot like that smell of a corpse, and it was hideous. "Do you think it's a dead animal?" Angeline asked me. "Lying around here somewhere." "More than likely," I said. "It makes me feel like throwing up." "Do you get the feeling that someone's actually watching us?" she asked me suddenly. "I do," I said. I really could sense that eyes were on us, but I did not know who or what they actually belonged to. "Maybe we should get out of here," I said suddenly. "Something is starting to creep me out." Everything in the forest was airily quiet and still. But maybe forests were always like this, I thought to myself. My sister and I had so little experience of country life, we didn't know what was normal and what was not. I had read stories about haunted forests before, So maybe we were on the edge for nothing. Or on an unconscious level, we may have been influenced by those horror stories and simply feeding our imaginations with fearful, horrifying delusions. Suddenly I detected the bough of a tree swaying from side to side and could see a dark, shadowy form moving between the leaves, and I was eager to see what it was. My anxiety rapidly retreated to be overtaken by fascination and intrigue. It had not even crossed my mind for a moment that there could be a predator out here in the woods. In the Bronx I was wary and streetwise, but out here in the forest, out in nature, I was whimsical, naive, and curious. I pushed back the branches to see what this creature was, and then I heard a thunderous movement like something heavy was moving away in the undergrowth and was trying to escape as quickly as it could. So I ran around as fast as I could to the other side of the tree, where the underground was less dense, and then I saw it. But what on earth was this thing? The creature looked at me with frightened eyes, as if it was scared of me, which was strange because next to this thing I was minute and tiny. This creature was big and looked like a massive ape that had a humanness to it. I had been to the zoo in New York once on my 8th birthday as a girl, and the gorillas there had a distinct look that reminded me of this creature. The gait was similar, so was the long, typical arms and the black hands. I would say this thing was twice the height that I was, which would put him at least 9 foot tall, and he must have weighed equally as much. The shoulders were big and the torso wide and ripped, and the head was shaped like a cone. It had a hairless, dark grey, leathery face with a brow ridge full of very deep wrinkles, a very flat nose, and an ape-like mouth. Oh, and I forgot to mention, from head to toe, apart from the face, he was seemingly covered in longish, black, human-like hair. The creature stood there just looking at me for a moment. I think it was almost as surprised to see me as I was to see him. However, the creature seemed timid and very afraid. This was seemingly incongruous for a creature with such an intimidating and formidable presence, which clearly had the power to kill someone like me with one fatal blow from its powerful hands. It rather reminded me of a pit bull once, owned by a very bad man in the Bronx, and this big dog with a formidable reputation was utterly terrified of a tiny poodle that was owned by a little old lady. You can imagine this gangster was furious and returned the pit bull to the pound in disgust, complaining that the dog was a wuss. I was not afraid of this thing, but I would have been terrified if it had not been so intimidated and wary of me. If it had approached me with an aggressive attitude, I would have been utterly terrified of this creature, and that was certain. This creature, worried brown eyes, glanced at my hands, looking alarmed and terrified, possibly wondering if I was holding a rifle of some kind. It then seemed to run backwards for a while, keeping its eyes on my hands, and looking so alarmed, as if he was expecting me to just suddenly shoot. It then turned around and ran away as fast as it possibly could, and its grace and agility and speed were phenomenal. I could not believe what I'd seen. "Did you see that?" I asked my sister. I could see that she was shaking and her face was deathly pale. "It was a gorilla man," she gasped in horror. "What's it doing in the forest, and what is it?" I never knew there was a creature like this living in Kentucky. We told our mother what we had seen, and she thought we must have been seeing something else and was confused. "There are no gorillas in America," she told us. "You must have seen something else, or this is one of your crazy jokes, which I don't find amusing." There was no point in telling my mother what we'd seen, because she was never going to believe us, and we were to find that telling our story was not going to go down well with anyone. Years later I was to reflect on that creature's reaction to us, and I can only imagine this thing had been an eyewitness to a negative interaction with a human before, and maybe he was a witness to something that involved one of his own kind being shot, so he associated an encounter with a human to be a negative and dangerous experience. Well, that was my take on it anyway, and I'm almost certain I'm right. My sister only got a brief sighting of that gorilla man, but she saw enough of him to know we'd seen something that belonged to the primate family. But when we told people about our experience, we were teased mercilessly and ridiculed, and our encounter was dismissed as made up and fanciful. I remember one girl at school in particular who poked so much fun at me for suggesting that I'd seen a gorilla man in the woods one day, and then several days later or weeks passed, and then she stopped teasing me. I was to find out later that she'd actually seen a creature herself when she was riding her bicycle, and it had freaked her out because the creature had growled at her and had looked exactly like an ape man. She never apologized to me, though. I just learnt about it from her ex-boyfriend. When I directly asked her about it, she claimed that he had been lying, but I wasn't so sure. I mean, he had no reason to make up something like that. So there you are. That's my story. I am married now, and I still live in Kentucky, and I will never forget my encounter with the hairy man. But the one thing I know for certain was that he wasn't aggressive, nor was he friendly, but was frightened. So I'm sure that that makes my encounter more unusual than most. I now believe I saw a Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Yeti or hairy man, and yes, they are out there, and they do exist. But I only ever got to see that creature once on our land. In my forest I did discover a nest once, and regularly heard knocking sounds, whooping sounds, owl calls when I was a child. I also noticed bark that was torn away to reveal underlying light wood, and that was also very strange to me. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.